My name is Kim Mejia, a genius who never missed a calculation, never forgot a debt, and multiplied the family fortune, while the others just squandered it. I was untouchable, or so I thought. Once, an executive took a massive loan from us and tried to pull a scam, fleeing the country by boat. I went after him alone and took down all his bodyguards. I told him, "You owe us, and nobody gets away without paying, at least not while they're alive." I tied him up and threw him into the sea a few times until he remembered where the money was. He paid me right then and there. When I returned home by boat, I was thinking my grandfather built this empire, but my uncles, the current owners, were only losing money. I was the only one in that room who actually solved problems. I did it all for my grandmother, who raised me when my parents died. I owed everything to her. But gratitude doesn't exist in this family. When my grandfather died, the war for inheritance began. One day, they called me for an urgent job. It was a lie. They betrayed me and tied me up inside my car. They took me to the coast and pushed the car into the sea, as if it were natural for others to see me inside a car, in the middle of the sea, as the car sank into the dark water. I thought this ending was completely unjust. After 30 years of loyalty and hard work, my own uncles killed me, just so they wouldn't have to share the money. But fate had other plans. When I opened my eyes, I didn't see the bottom of the ocean. I was lying on the beach. It was 1990. I'm a 17-year-old boy again, but with 40 years of experience, hatred, and knowledge of the future inside my head. But suddenly, he was surprised by a guy looking for a fight. As he got up from the kick, he noticed something curious in front of him. There was a group of high school students exchanging punches among themselves, which made the hero think that even in paradise, it was total chaos. The fight was intense, with people taking kicks and others getting thrown to the ground. The beach was a complete war zone. Our protagonist had no idea what was going on. One of the delinquents lunged right at him, but with surprising ease. Our hero landed a solid punch on the thug. The protagonist noticed his body felt lighter, as if he were young again. Two more thugs charged straight at him, but with all his speed and strength, the protagonist swiftly kicked them away. None of them were a match for the protagonist, who stood out every time. As if that wasn't enough, the protagonist swiftly took down the delinquents one by one, with tremendous ease. After that, the hero shot a menacing glance at the thugs and told the bastards they had lost, and to get out of there utterly terrified. The delinquents just ran away as fast as they could. Thus, the protagonist sat on the ground, tired from the fight. One of the hero's allies taunted the losers, asking where they were going, and stating that when they met again, he'd give them a good beating. This guy asked if Maya was okay, and said he'd come to the beach to flirt with girls, but only found boys there. He then asked if the hero wanted to smoke, as he was sweating, which made the protagonist wonder if this guy was really a high school student. Seeing the boy's name on his uniform, the protagonist wondered if that was Lee Myung-soo, his best friend from elementary school. Another friend of theirs arrived, saying that, as expected, Muyak was still the best fighter, defeating all of them alone. This guy was Park Han-sung, a close friend of the protagonist, who had a police officer father, helping them out of trouble. Now, the hero wondered where they were, and his confused friends asked what he meant. They responded that they were in Gwangali. The boys asked if the protagonist had hit his head, as he had started using the Seoul dialect, and was also asking where they were. After this discovery, our protagonist urgently asked what year and date it was. The reply came, September 21st. The year was 1990. His friends were absolutely certain he'd bumped his head somewhere. Muyak scanned everything around him, desperate to grasp the strange situation. Our hero reflected on all the events so far, and then he was certain he'd drown in the sea, transported 30 years into the past. His companions were already starving, and decided to hunt for a bowl of ramen. Suddenly, a critical memory surged through our hero's mind, as he remembered that fateful day. So he bolted at full speed, leaving his friends utterly confused. That day was when his grandmother had tragically passed away due to a sudden heart attack. The doctors then had stated that if she'd been found earlier and an ambulance called, she wouldn't have died. Arriving breathless at his old house, he's greeted by his grandmother, alive and well, asking if school had ended early. The moment he touched his grandmother's hands, he couldn't hold back and broke down in tears, overwhelmed by all their precious memories. She notices our protagonist panting heavily and asks if he ran home so fast. Because he was hungry, our hero still couldn't stop his tears. His concerned grandmother asks if something happened, but he simply replies he missed her very, very much. His grandmother, confused by his behavior, was completely puzzled by his intense behavior. So she mused it was as if Muyak was a child again. She fondly added he was so handsome when he smiled, and even when he cried like this, marveling at how much he'd grown up. But our hero quickly dried his tears and insisted they had no time to waste. They needed to rush to the hospital immediately. Our protagonist urgently argued that his grandmother could faint at any moment, and they needed to confirm that at the hospital. But she hesitated, insisting she wasn't sick. A desperate Muyak implored his grandmother to hurry, because her life was truly on the line. But she still couldn't grasp why she'd die now. With a bright, happy expression, she chirped she'd only die after seeing him married and raising his children. Then she calmly walked inside. She told her grandson to head to his room, promising to whip up dinner in a flash. Soon, they were gathered, happily eating their meal. His grandmother knew her grandson wasn't too fond of banchan, but he insisted he liked everything and would eat it all, watching the protagonist devour his food. His grandmother joked that if anyone saw him, they'd think he hadn't eaten in years. His grandmother then left the room, telling him to wait, because she'd also prepared his favorite corn juice. The protagonist immediately broke down in tears again, confessing that all he truly needed was his grandmother's homemade food. He wondered what he was even doing, acting as a mere lapdog for the Chun family. But suddenly, a noise from the other room startled him. Rushing in, his grandmother lay unconscious on the floor. In his utter despair, the protagonist's only solution was to rush her to the hospital. The old woman was already resting in a room, but remained unconscious. In the doctor's office, the doctor stated that if they had delayed much longer, she would be in dire straits. However, they'd still need to conduct more tests. The doctor then revealed that surgery would be necessary for his grandmother. If she remained like this, she would constantly faint. The protagonist was shocked when it came time to pay the hospital bill. With not a single penny in his pocket, just a short time ago, he was about to collect a huge sum. But to his surprise, his partner offered to cover the bill, explaining he had just received his father's pension. It came from an adult entertainment venue that very morning. The protagonist thanked him profusely, promising to pay him back as soon as he possibly could. But his partner waved it off, warning him about his behavior, saying this money was for his grandmother's expenses. They told him not to worry about repayment, and to just focus on taking care of his grandmother for now. However, he was questioned about her condition and medications. In the protagonist's conversation with the doctor, it was confirmed that surgery would be necessary, and the cost was estimated at around 10 million. He knew 10 million won was barely anything before his death, but now he clutched just a few measly coins. At a payphone, our protagonist hatched a brilliant plan to cover the exorbitant surgery fee. He dialed Pyong Chong Don directly and declared he demanded to speak with President Tyson himself because he carried a vital message for him. The message: his only daughter's son, Chim Misuk, longed to see his grandfather on the hospital terrace. Our protagonist was lost in profound contemplation. He mused that back in 1990, there truly weren't many towering buildings. So it was exactly as he recalled, fascinated by the undeniable truth that he was truly back in the 90s, but also gripped by the chilling fear that he could still be murdered. He suspected his uncle, Chien Suman, from 30 years later, believing he was the only one who could have sent subordinates to eliminate him. Yet, he still couldn't fathom the reason for such an act, as he firmly believed he was still useful to them. He wondered, could it have been someone else? The protagonist started to suspect Chien Suhan and Chien Juwan, But that didn't matter now. This was his moment. He could finally dismantle the Chien family and put an end to Tazing capital. Suddenly, a delinquent, also on the terrace, began to eye our protagonist suspiciously. Our hero wondered who's calling out to him now, while the punk brazenly demanded his name. The protagonist retorted, why would he want to know, thinking he must be some petty thug, not understanding the protagonist's attitude. The delinquent sneered that he was trying to act tough. The two questioned each other's manners. When speaking to elders so boldly, our hero shot back at the bully that he should introduce himself first, before asking for anyone else's name. Already exasperated by this, the delinquent declared his name was Park Dong-soo and challenged if he'd ever heard that name. The protagonist, of course, already knew that name. He was the second in command of the infamous Seisen gang, a legend who became an heir after just 2 years in the gang. But back in 1990, he was merely hunted down for his boss's crimes, only to be found dead in a hotel at the young age of 29. So, the delinquent couldn't believe the protagonist, didn't recognize him, so the protagonist asks if he used to run a comic book store, but already losing patience. The bully snaps that he already said his name, and now demands to know the protagonist's. When the hero finally says his name, the troublemaker declares he has the name of a killer, which instantly irritates the protagonist, thinking he was nothing but a childish scoundrel. The delinquent continued. There were rumors of the protagonist being known as the good kid from room 405, who meticulously took care of his grandma and did everything she ever asked. The hero replies that it was only normal, since his grandmother was his only remaining family, and the troublemaker agrees, saying it was natural. The bully presumes that the protagonist will be a student from Dongsung Vocational School, judging by his uniform. The hero confirms and asks if he was a thug. The tattooed one quickly asserts that he is not, and asks why he thought that. The delinquent's condition suggested he had been stabbed by someone and then thrown into the hospital. The bully argues that it was normal for men to get stabbed once in a while, but kids like the protagonist wouldn't know until they grew up. After that, he adds that the kid shouldn't be afraid of him, as he seemed very calm in front of him. But the hero saw no reason to be scared. The protagonist was irritating the punk, because he always had the last word. Already fed up, the hero asks if he was done talking, because he wanted to leave. And so the delinquent says he was finished. As he leaves, the delinquent calls the protagonist by the killer's name, and tells him to take good care of his grandma. At that point, he saw some gang that wasn't nationally recognized, but it wasn't a small amount at all. As he headed to his grandma's room, the protagonist muses that maybe one day, the guy could actually be useful to him. But upon arriving, he encountered a mysterious figure in a sleek suit. His grandma informed him someone was waiting. It was a young man in a sharp tie. It was Director Ha, who already knew the protagonist. The two stared at each other for a moment. Miek then suggested they go outside to talk. They headed to a coffee house, where the man introduced himself as Ham Yong-hoon. He worked for Director Tae-san. Thus, the protagonist realized he was his grandfather's trusted right-hand man. This man was incredibly trustworthy in his boss's eyes. In the protagonist's former life, this man was the only one who ever told him about his grandfather. At his grandma's funeral, the man in the suit said he needed the protagonist to go with him to Seoul. But the hero quickly interrupted, asking why the president didn't come personally. But upon seeing the protagonist's frank look, he was startled. The director understood his stance and said it wasn't appropriate for his age. However, it was so natural he couldn't be bluffing. Mr. Ha responded that the director was a busy man and didn't have time to meet him. But the protagonist revealed he wasn't talking about him, but rather about his mother, Kim Mi-sin. He knew she wouldn't come. The protagonist imagined the man would say it was audacious to ask for her visit, remembering that even the president didn't go to the columbarium after her death. Thus, the hero asserted that if the president wanted to meet him, he would have to go to his mother first. In the protagonist's past, he was forced to obey their orders quietly, as at that time, he was nothing more than an orphan. At his grandmother's funeral, Mr. Ha took care of all the costs and told him to meet with the president afterward. The president said that the protagonist shouldn't worry about his survival if he did as instructed at that time. Our hero was cornered with no other option. Without his grandfather's support, he'd be forced to drop out of school too. But this time, things are different. Our protagonist was no longer the same. Armed with crucial information about them, he rose from the table and instructed Mr. Ha to inform the president that if he wanted to meet, he'd have to come in person. He then bid Manhua farewell, wishing him a safe journey home. Mr. Ha, however, was completely overwhelmed by the intense aura our protagonist was emitting. The report he'd received about our hero painted him as a mere troublemaker who just wandered around looking for fights. But now he questioned everything. He mused that Mrs. Kim Min-sun was certainly no ordinary child. Back at the hospital, the protagonist's grandmother was astounded to hear that the president wanted her grandson to come to Seoul. Our hero then told her that the president would have to visit his mother first, since, after 17 years since her passing, he still hadn't visited her grave. His grandmother was aghast, asking him, "Do you even know who your mother's father is?" But he already knew, stating that business is in Seoul. The protagonist revealed he had called them, using the phone number his grandmother had hidden. He then asked her, "Is that the number you use to contact your family?" Grandma pleaded that he should at least be cordial to his grandfather, but he firmly stated he didn't want to see him. After being ignored for 17 long years, worried, his grandmother insisted he couldn't do that. However, the protagonist replied that she should only worry about her health, because with her by his side, he wouldn't need anyone else to make him happy. His grandmother, after all, was the person who loved him most in this life. In the past, he had sent her away without a word, but in this new life, he would dedicate himself to her happiness. Back at the Seoul mansion, the president confirmed with his servant the protagonist's bold claim about needing to visit him personally if he truly wished to meet him. Mr. Hess then stated the meeting would only take place after the president visited his daughter's grave. To the president, this was absolutely absurd. It made him wonder if the protagonist was incredibly brave or simply foolish. Now, the old man revealed that the kid had definitely captured his interest. He was determined to go to Busan to see what kind of boy this kid truly was. And if his grandson proved useful, he would mold him to the bone to become a servant for his family. The protagonist returned to his class, looking utterly downcast. But soon his best friend called him over to sit with him. His partner asked about his grandmother's condition, to which the hero replied that she had already left the hospital. His friend said it had been a while since the protagonist had been to school. So, he asked if he wanted to skip class to play billiards. But the protagonist quickly declined the offer, saying that, as his partner mentioned, he hadn't been to class in a long time. Suddenly, the hero focused completely on the lesson, writing furiously in his notebook, while saying they should be ready for class. But this behavior completely startled everyone present in the room. Seeing Miek actually studying, they wondered what on earth had happened to him. His best friend cried out, saying there were 9 years left until the world ended, and the protagonist was studying and reading a book, realizing that something was definitely wrong. Witnessing this, the protagonist remembered that studying was his absolute least priority when he was in high school, starting to study only after finding his grandfather. In the past, the protagonist was oppressed by his old grandfather, who always expected the best possible result, and the only goal set by him was for him to attend Korea's law university, although his loan shark grandfather saw no real chance of his grandson achieving this feat. He would use it as a metric to see if he was worth anything. The old man had guaranteed, without a doubt, that he wouldn't starve under his roof. But if our hero failed, he could kiss his relationship with the chin. Family goodbye. So our protagonist buckled down, studied hard, and got accepted into the university. This meant he could finally work for his grandfather. But from that moment on, his family exploited him relentlessly, treating him like a mere blood servant. Now, our protagonist was determined to change his fate. He's been studying hard to achieve his new goal. Meanwhile, several students were loitering in the hallway, while class was still in session. Suddenly, One of the teachers stormed in, reprimanding them, bat in hand. He then stomps into the classroom, roughly slams his notebook on the table, and demands everyone pay attention and bow before him. All the students immediately lower their heads in his presence. And with that, the next thing he did was call our protagonist to the front. He glared at him, asking how many days he'd skipped school, then questioned if he thought this was an amusement park, where he could just waltz in and out as he pleased. Our protagonist apologizes and explains that he had to take care of his grandmother. But at that very moment, he receives a harsh slap from the teacher, who clearly doesn't believe his little story. The teacher snarls that he's a rotten troublemaker, and someone like him would never actually care for his grandmother. He was probably out drinking somewhere. The teacher still didn't buy his excuse. Meanwhile, our protagonist remembers this teacher from his first grade classroom, where he'd abused his students like animals. The teacher continues to belittle our hero, saying he must be out of his mind to confront him in such a way. Our protagonist reflects that the teacher must be a little over 30 years old, and he just can't understand why he's treated this way. That bastard shamelessly asked for bride money back when he visited the protagonist's grandmother, completely disregarding this act. Our hero forced his grandmother to stop handing over the thousands of won she fought so hard to earn. This is exactly why the scoundrel always picked on him whenever he had the chance. The teacher kept right on mistreating Wyack, forcing him to lie on the floor, claiming he was always looking for trouble. The abuser insisted that kids like our protagonist always turned into gangsters after school. But suddenly, the vice principal bursts into the room, sending a wave of panic through the teacher. He was asking if a student named Mutiak was in that classroom. The teacher went into shock after realizing he'd been caught red-handed. A sleek black car and the suited mister. Hell, we're waiting for the protagonist outside the school. As the man gestured for our hero to get into the car, the entire school watched from the windows, baffled by the sight of such an imported car. The moment the protagonist steps into the car, he's face to face with his grandfather. President Chien Tae-zin was waiting for him, asking if he was Mysic's son. The protagonist mused that they had finally met again. The last time he'd seen him was before he passed away, 20 years ago. Thus, he confirms his father was Kim Tae-soo, and his mother, Chien Mis-sok. With an imposing air of superiority, the old man declares he's here in person, as the hero requested. Soon after, the protagonist then asks if his grandfather stopped to visit his mother's grave on the way here, and the old man confirms that he did. Seriously, the protagonist argues that he'd heard his grandfather never even visited his mother once, so he figured it was more appropriate to stop by before speaking with him. He adds that his grandmother, who'd raised him, wasn't doing well, so he couldn't possibly abandon her, and had no interest in apologizing for it. Taking in the hero's defiant posture, the old man questions if he was truly a child, since he showed no intimidation in his presence whatsoever. The old man then asked if the protagonist truly knew him. Our protagonist knew. He was a true legend in the lending industry. Starting out as a mere day laborer in the South, there wasn't a single soul, not one, from chaebol to politician, who hadn't borrowed money from him back then. Even by the 90s, he commanded the entire nation with trillions in his grasp. However, the protagonist replies he only knew him a little, just that he controlled some business. The old man states he ran a small lending business in Seoul, and then asks if the protagonist knew what that was. But the hero knew it was anything but small. Without beating around the bush, the old man asked the protagonist what he truly wanted. With unwavering confidence, the protagonist reveals he desired only one thing: to dismantle the Chien family and seize their fortune. The ultimate revenge the protagonist could exact upon the Chien brothers was their money. They were set to inherit a colossal fortune after Chien Tyson's passing, and the hero planned to claim that entire inheritance for himself. But to do that, he needed to secretly secure funds to fight them, without the Chien family ever finding out. Once more, the old man asks why he'd been summoned, and the protagonist replies that he needed to borrow money. Upon hearing this, The old man muses that after everything, it still boiled down to money. Finding it utterly pathetic despite everything, he asks how much the hero wanted. The protagonist reveals his grandmother, who raised him for 17 years, needed urgent heart surgery, so he required 10 million won for that. And he adds he also needs 1 million won every month until his graduation for tuition fees and living expenses. Upon hearing his proposal, the old man says he could easily handle that for him, questioning the protagonist's sanity for calling him there for such pocket change. But the protagonist then reveals he wasn't asking for it for free, though. He merely wanted to borrow it for a while. The old man found this quite amusing. This kid asking for money, especially since he couldn't even pay the interest. Yet still didn't want the loan for free. The gentleman then responded that it wasn't hard for a loan shark to lend money, but they didn't just hand out cash without a good reason. Now, intimidating the protagonist, the old man demanded to know how he'd pay it back, asking if he had any collateral or credibility to offer. But quickly, the protagonist declared his collateral was his brain, an answer that genuinely surprised the old man. The hero asserted that if he received the loan, he would enroll in Korea University and use that achievement as collateral to pay off the debt. The president was utterly speechless. Upon hearing the protagonist's bold proposal in the past, the old man had actually asked the protagonist to do this, but now this was his grandson's own offer. Shin Tae-hyun had a powerful yearning for academic achievements, but he couldn't get a proper education because of his poverty, and as his businesses grew, he became even more obsessed with his children's academic accomplishments. Even the protagonist's mother was accepted into a prestigious Seoul university, but she ended up dropping out. So, having his grandson accepted into Korea University would be a tempting proposal to potentially erase his own inferiority complex regarding his past education. The old man reflected that the protagonist was previously incapable of getting into the university because his grades were so poor. Thus, he thought the boy might just be bluffing. At that moment, the gentleman questioned the protagonist's confidence, asking what he would do if he failed. However, the hero reflected that he had succeeded once, but he had no guarantee he would succeed again, and he knew he should extract as much interest from his grandfather as possible. He responds that if he doesn't get in, he'll offer up his head and even his body, asking if that would be enough. Upon hearing the protagonist offer his body, the old man declared that was more than sufficient. Soon after, the protagonist added that if he passes, he would like a gift to congratulate him. And the old man was absolutely astonished, wondering if he wanted even more as well. The protagonist merely said he would only reveal it after he got into Korea school. However, he hinted that he planned to ask for a very big gift. When that happened, the old man's reaction was nothing less than bursting into laughter, saying he could hardly wait to see how grand the gift would be. However, the old man warned that if the protagonist failed, as promised, he would be his, and would have to do anything the old man asked. These things he would do would make even demons afraid to do them, but the protagonist didn't back down, and declared the deal was already made. But after the long conversation, the old man sped away in his car, and the protagonist muttered that old gray man was trying to scare a child. The protagonist liked the idea that even demons would fear the old man's tasks. The protagonist exclaimed that if he had to become a demon, he would become the one who would tear the Chin family apart. In traffic, the old man commented to his driver that the protagonist was a fun kid, and the driver revealed that he was shocked too. See how different the protagonist was from the reports he had received. The gentleman mused. He had encountered all kinds of people in his business, from those who didn't pay back and boldly asked for more, to those who brought gangsters to threaten him, and even people who sold their own children for money. Then the gentleman revealed that, after making many deals with various people over time, he couldn't distinguish what kind of person they were. At first glance, he argued that body language, eyes, and tone of voice could say a lot about what kind of person you were. However, The old man couldn't quite get a read on our protagonist, claiming he seemed to be the only one truly judging him. Upon hearing this, the driver remarked, "It seems the old man has taken a liking to the kid." But then, suddenly, the gentleman instructed them to head straight to Dahang Hospital. Inside the hospital, our protagonist asked the staff to take great care of his grandmother. The doctor reassured him, saying not to worry, as it wasn't a difficult surgery at all. As our hero left the surgery wing, the delinquent from the other day suddenly arrived. He insisted that the protagonist go to school every day and eat 3 proper meals a day. The big guy then invited him to smoke out on the terrace, but our hero questioned whether that was really appropriate to say to a high school student, even admitting he felt a pang of guilt. The delinquent then questioned why our protagonist was studying so hard at such a young age, telling him he should be out enjoying life. Meanwhile, the bum stated that if he really needed to study, he wouldn't hold him back. And with that, he handed him a piece of gum, advising that whenever he felt sleepy, he should chew it. Then, he said goodbye, promising to see him later. Our protagonist reflected that this man, at that very moment, was a well-known criminal, responsible for a notorious gang that commanded hundreds of members. But he hadn't expected the guy to be such a fun character. However, soon, when the crime war inevitably began, Park Dong-soo would meet a terrible end. While reflecting, our protagonist suddenly noticed that suspicious men had arrived at the hospital entrance, and they were carrying weapons. Our protagonist knew that, supposedly, Park Dong-soo wasn't supposed to die that day, so perhaps he could bring him over to his side. At that moment, at the reception desk, the suspicious men boldly questioned the attendant, asking where Park Dong-soo's ward was. Frightened, the girl nervously questioned their relationship with the patient, but the men rudely responded that they were simply there to visit him. Suddenly, our protagonist made his appearance. He greets them, asking if they were looking for his brother. He claims to be the younger brother, then offers to guide the men to his room. This leaves the guys utterly confused. Our protagonist is bothered by the fact that these annoying worms are causing such a commotion in the hospital, where his grandmother is undergoing surgery. So he decides to lead them outside the hospital. As the men follow our hero, they soon realize what he's planning and question where they're being taken. One maniac asks if they're here to eliminate Park Dong-soo, and one of the men pulls out a knife, demanding to know who our protagonist is. Our protagonist is already stretching, preparing for a fight, but suddenly, Park Dong-soo appears behind them, asking if they have no shame, pointing a knife at a student. One of the thugs reacts by charging at the delinquent to punch him, but surprisingly, Park Dong-soo defends the punch using his head. The guy cries out in pain, clutching his hand. The tattooed man trips him and lands a solid punch, making him bounce off the ground. The other members are already on high alert, and while one mugger takes off his shirt, another charges at him with a knife. But Park quickly stops this other scoundrel with a few blows, and before he even falls to the ground, Park hurls him into another thug. Then, with incredible precision, he throws his sandal directly at the same thug's face, then kicks both of them away. The remaining man notices the glass windows beside him, so he tries to hit Park with them, but it doesn't work at all. Instead, Dong-soo punches through the window, hitting the thug and sending him flying. The relentless Park and our protagonist stare at each other for a few moments, without saying a word. After everything, they're already back inside the hospital. Park says it felt good to finally let loose after a while, mentioning he'd fought those guys before, over territory he already knew. They were actively searching for him while he was laid up in the hospital. Unbeknownst to them, he'd already been keeping a close eye on their movements. The protagonist had already lured them straight to that very spot, which is why the bully remarked that you had some serious guts, because he didn't even flinch, even when they held a knife right to his throat. In reply to this, the protagonist coolly reveals he only acted so boldly because he knew Park would definitely be coming. He also casually drops, that he'd spotted Park's subordinates staking out the hospital. Even if the protagonist hadn't directly intervened, the outcome would have unfolded exactly the same way, with Dong-soo utterly dominating them all anyway. However, Park still feels he owes the protagonist a significant debt, so he asks what his one true wish would be, vowing to provide anything from mountains of cash to any woman he desired. The protagonist, deep in thought, reflects that Dong-soo would be the crucial first pawn in his elaborate scheme. So he must make Dong-soo his own, his ultimate asset. Thus, the hero instructs the heavily tattooed man to gather his most trusted subordinates and then go into deep hiding for the next 3 months. The big guy quickly flares up, thoroughly irritated, claiming the protagonist could have asked for literally anything, but that he was talking complete and utter nonsense, asking, "Why on earth would I need to hide?" The protagonist then gravely reveals that the president is about to declare an all-out war on crime and arrest every single criminal organization in the nation. Park is thrown into absolute total shock upon hearing the shocking news of this war on crime. Back in October 1990, the president had issued a special decree to quell public outrage over various rampant corruptions, even though there had been a major crackdown on the 5 most serious crimes. Just the previous year, the president's current announcement of a war on crime would be fundamentally different. This was a colossal operation designed to utterly eradicate both major and minor criminal organizations and all those linked to them. The protagonist was now telling him to keep his location an absolute, tight-lipped secret, even from other criminal organizations themselves. He added that Park should be extremely cautious around his own boss, Lee Se-sung. And with that, the protagonist brought their intense conversation to a close by stating this was his one and only absolute wish. The hero knew the weighty decision now rested solely with Park, and that if he survived this, he could prove incredibly useful someday. A month later, what our hero told Dong-soo had chillingly come true. News channels were buzzing, reporting that the Constitution now granted the president total authority to clean up everything. And get this, the papers reported that even the prosecutors and police forces were fully mobilized. All organizations in Busan were swiftly rounded up. Park Dong-soo only heard this from his colleagues, but he already knew the full story. He warned his companions not to lift a finger or go out stirring up trouble for no good reason. Upon reading the newspaper, the small-time gangster was utterly shocked. It had unfolded exactly as our protagonist predicted when he was first told this. He had only scoffed, questioning what utter nonsense our hero was spouting. However, he did say reunification was a wish worth having. The protagonist, with a knowing smile, exclaimed that their wish would be fulfilled in Germany, but not by them. Back in the present, the frightened gangster wondered just who this mysterious figure, Kim Moo-hyuk, was. Meanwhile, back at home, our protagonist reassured his grandmother that the old man had taken care of absolutely everything and that she shouldn't worry about a single thing. Our hero explained he'd inherited an apartment and a sizable fortune from his grandfather, who had been absent for 17 long years. He then told his beloved grandmother that she didn't need to work another day in her life. The kind lady couldn't possibly accept all this calmly, but our protagonist passionately argued that she had worked tirelessly to raise him alone and deserved so much more than just that. He promised her she would live a life of complete comfort and urged her to think only of her health. Suddenly, the door burst open as our protagonist's friend arrived, excitedly announcing they'd bought ribs and warmly congratulating our hero's grandmother on her discharge. They were all so excited and happy. They quickly made plans to grill the meat and enjoy the rest of the day to the fullest. A little while later, the boys were at school, casually commenting on the beautiful weather. But the upcoming test for that day was totally ruining everyone's mood. The protagonists' friends were bickering about who was the better student, with one friend in the top 500 and the other already outside the top 520. One friend then asked about the exam, and the protagonist admitted he'd only improved a little, saying he still needed to work harder. The hero reflected that it was incredibly difficult to get back to studying after so long, but he'd managed to do a good job. And as the boys arrived in the classroom, One of them blurted out that Muyak was in first place on the exam. His friends were utterly shocked by this news, and the boy explained he'd heard it from the teacher's office that very morning. Suddenly, one of the students informed the protagonist that he was being called to the teacher's office. His classmates immediately assumed he was about to receive some award, so he should be excited. Inside the office, the teacher sternly asked if the protagonist knew why he'd been called there. Mayak, unresponsive, left the teacher without an answer, which made him slap Mayak. His classmates, watching from the window, were anxious to see the scene play out once again. Once more, the teacher demanded if he didn't know why he was there, and the protagonist confidently replied, no. Thus, he received yet another slap in the face. The teacher then continued, questioning what exactly he did on the exam, whether he cheated or did something wrong. The teacher argued that the hero, who was among the worst students in the school last semester, was now, in this one, suddenly in first place. The hero knew the teacher acted this way because days earlier he'd mentioned knowing that the man in the car the protagonist got into was his grandfather. Thus, the teacher argued it was only fair for the protagonist's grandfather to congratulate him, since he had been his guardian since elementary school. This attitude utterly disgusted the protagonist, who declared the old man was the epitome of trash, much worse than he'd remembered. Our hero simply replied that his grandfather lived in Seoul, and that if he wanted to meet him, he'd have to go there himself. The teacher then mused that perhaps the old man might come see him again. Undeterred, the teacher tried again to convince our protagonist to speak with his grandfather, but he simply stated that if that was all, he would leave, as he had an exam soon. This dismissive attitude sparked unease and anger in the teacher, who called me back, now fully back in the present. The abuser was convinced our protagonist had cheated and demanded to know if it was just him, or if others had helped him as well. Yet again, our protagonist responded that he hadn't cheated at all. The teacher retorted he had already suspended the protagonist before for issues and accused him of causing trouble again, asking if he'd learned that from his grandmother. Upon mentioning his grandmother, our hero thought that guy had completely crossed the line, being utterly annoying. The scoundrel then asked what the hero was staring at and told him he should gouge out his eyes. Our protagonist was absolutely furious, telling the old man to apologize immediately because whether he studied or was cheating or his grandmother had nothing to do with it. But once again, he received another slap across the face, with the teacher calling him crazy. Following that, the tutor began tearing up all of the protagonist's tests, claiming they didn't even need to be checked, because they would be marked as 0 for cheating anyway. The teacher angrily declared that the protagonist was suspended indefinitely and stated he would love to expel him, but couldn't. Not satisfied, our hero proposed a shocking bet with his teacher. He exclaimed that he would solve all the test questions right in front of him, just as he did in the exam. And so, if he didn't achieve the same score, he could be expelled from school without a single issue. But if he achieved the same score, he demanded that the teacher resign immediately from his position at the school, which absolutely shocked everyone present. The teacher, once again, resorted to violence. He was about to strike our hero with his stick, but our protagonist effortlessly stopped him, boldly asking if the teacher lacked confidence. And with that, our protagonist made a bold demand. He demanded they bring out the test papers. Not long after these dramatic events, everyone was still on edge, awaiting the outcome. Our protagonist had already blazed through most of the tests. As the teacher began grading them, it became strikingly clear. All of them held the exact same maximum score. Another teacher exclaimed, "The protagonist is finishing his English test now. If he gets a perfect score on this one, too, he'll have aced all subjects." Piling on the pressure, our hero announced he was on his very last question. "And if I'm correct," he declared, "you'll have to leave this school forever." He then added that if the teacher didn't keep his promise, he couldn't expect our hero to treat him like a teacher. Every single person watching grew incredibly tense at the unfolding drama. However, the protagonist suddenly declared that if the teacher simply apologized, he would immediately stop solving the questions. The abuser clearly didn't appreciate our hero's tone. But just then, the principal made a sudden appearance, telling them both to stop, declaring it was enough. He added that the protagonist had already undeniably proven he didn't cheat on the test. The principal then firmly stated that the teacher must apologize to the protagonist and should even praise him, so his grades will improve. As everyone watched on, the scoundrel grudgingly apologized to the protagonist. He claimed he had misunderstood everything, but still couldn't meet the protagonist's gaze. With utter conviction and brimming confidence, the protagonist slammed his pen onto the table and declared, dead serious, "I'm returning to my classroom." As he walked toward his destination, all the students watching erupted in celebration of his victory. The students anxiously monitored the scoreboards and rankings. Then, to everyone's amazement, it was announced that the protagonist had actually snagged first place in the exams. His friends then chuckled about how terrified the teacher looked. Despite all that, however, they just couldn't believe Muyuk had truly come in first. So, they questioned him, asking if he'd go to a Korean university. Very seriously, our hero told Myung-soo to buckle down and study hard, promising to help him every step of the way. He also advised Han-seong to pick up judo once more. The protagonist reflected that Myung-soo had excellent high school grades, but ultimately, he chose a vocational school to pursue his passion. Meanwhile, Han-seong was a promising judo fighter during high school, but he chose a school without a sports team, just to stay with his friends. However, our hero's friends weren't exactly thrilled about these ideas. One considered working in factories while young, and another thought about taking over his father's business. The protagonist approached them, stating gravely that in the near future, they need to accomplish important things in Seoul. Realistically, he exclaimed, it would be incredibly tough to do it all by himself. He truly hoped for their help down the line. Thus, they were determined to work hard and go to school together, alongside the protagonist, reflecting that his revenge wasn't guaranteed. Just by knowing the future, he concluded that he needed partners who wouldn't betray him, and the comrades he could trust to have his back were none other than his friends. As time passed, the protagonist kept his laser focus on his studies, effortlessly securing first place. In the final exam rankings, Myung-soo's grades weren't the absolute best, but he began to improve, just like Han-seong, who had also started practicing judo once more. Thus, all the pieces were finally falling into place, and after a while, on a cold and snowy day, the protagonist found himself facing the impenetrable fortress of the Jin family, and alongside Han and Dawn, Paeyong. Ducheong was one of the wealthiest regions in the country, serving as the Cheong family's base. Paeyong-do-cheong, while his properties were considered the most valuable in terms of mobilizing capital. The Third Republic seized power through a military coup, and then came the Fourth Republic, which also took power through yet another coup, all within the same political regime. However, the Great Loan Shark's impenetrable fortress shielded his wealth from all these powerful forces, and at that very moment, our protagonist was having dinner with his grandfather. Inside the residence, he reflected. This scenario hadn't happened in his past life, since he'd only met Chien-tai's son, long after being accepted into Korea University. Thus, he concluded it meant his grandfather's evaluation of him had completely changed. In that cold, mysterious room, the men's silence spoke louder than any words. The old man commented that he'd heard his grandson managed to rank first in school twice. However, the old man argued that the school's overall level wasn't exceptional, so it didn't mean much. But it seemed he wasn't just bribing last time. Thus, the loan shark was surprised and clearly pleased with his grandson's intelligence. So he said that as long as he kept those promises, he wanted to gift him something, and he asked what he'd like. However, still keeping his mysterious air, the prodigy replied that, as he'd mentioned before, he would only reveal what he wanted once he entered Korea University. The old man knew the promise was that when he entered that university, the gift wouldn't matter. Still, he wanted to know what our proto wanted. At that moment, the hero noticed his grandfather was trying to be kind, So he concluded that he should ask for an allowance, and boldly, the protagonist asked his grandfather for some shares of his company. The old man was utterly surprised by the request and asked if the protagonist understood anything. Let's talk about the stock market. The protagonist admitted he didn't know much about it, which is exactly why he was asking for help. So, our hero then wondered which companies specifically would be good options for him to buy shares in. The hero then presumed that if he asked for shares instead of money, his grandfather would consider it. A truly thoughtful request from his grandson. The old man smiled and then asked the director about their current stake in the Diane Corporation, and the answer revealed a 4% stake. To everyone's absolute surprise, the loan shark ordered that this entire percentage be immediately allocated to his grandson and made sure they'd handle the taxes correctly. As it was a gift, the hero was stunned to see that he'd actually be given shares of Diane, because at that time, Diane was the company with the largest conglomerate, ranking number 1 among all huge corporations. However, after the founder's death, the company had split due to conflicts among the heirs, and owning shares of that company wasn't just about money. Now, the hero was immensely grateful to his grandfather, especially keeping in mind that it was extremely difficult to obtain Diane's shares. Even if you had all the money in the world, our prodigal didn't expect to receive such an incredible gift, as he honestly thought he'd only get some paltry allowance. And at that very moment, quite unexpectedly, the loan shark's sons had arrived at the residence. People with a strong presence were gathered there. Among them were Chien Suman and Chien Suan. Suman immediately asked if our protagonist was Nisik's son. Now, Mike was face to face with the very people he had been desperately searching for, those very scoundrels who ordered his death. The old man told our protagonist to greet his uncles, but our protagonist knew they were suspicious, though he wasn't entirely sure given the circumstances, so he decided to stay under the radar. He introduced himself formally, yet friendly, and his uncle then mentioned they'd heard he grew up with a lot of difficulty, without his mother, raised only by his grandmother. Thus, Suman approached our protagonist and told him anything he needed. He just had to say it, because despite everything, they were still family. Then one of the sons asked if the mother-in-law of one of the daughters was doing well with her business ventures. He'd heard that the Samsung group was in a difficult position. However, the girl replied that everything was fine, and it was just the media making up stories as they pleased. She added that her father-in-law would never let that happen. The old man agreed, saying that man was relentless, never shedding a tear or a drop of blood. The loan shark added that his daughter should clarify that her father-in-law could always count on him, because through marriage, they were also family and shouldn't be ignored. Now, the white-haired man questioned his other son about Mr. Kim and was told that the father-in-law was doing a good job by actively participating in political matters without any issues. Once again, the old man said that if they ran into problems, they could come to him to avoid any losses, as he didn't want to get involved in trouble due to any illegal exchanges. And after all this conversation, the white-haired man asked if any of his sons had sent money to President Lee Hock-soo. He argued that money shouldn't be used that way, as the requester should come before him and plead for the money, and thus he'd never give it. Before that, one of the sons got nervous and asked his father if he didn't know who President Lee Hock-soo was, and feared he would break his promise. Another son was also terrified, saying that if their father did that, the Chi and Pang wouldn't just stand by. And so, tension filled the air. With all the idle chatter, the old man became furious. As the atmosphere grew even darker outside, the protagonist was now inside his mother's old room, and while rummaging through the shelves, he reflected that it was exactly as it had been in his past life. He then picked up one of the books from the shelf and started flipping through its pages. He came face to face with an old photograph of his grandfather and his late mother. This was, he realized then, it was the only picture he'd ever found of his mom from his past life, and his grandfather hadn't left any others. It was as if that old man wanted the whole world to completely forget the hero's mother. Suddenly, the room's door swung open. While the protagonist was still rummaging through the items, he was surprised to see Chien Jivan, who immediately questioned if he was Mizuki's son. Muyak instantly suspected this absolute bastard had ordered him killed in his previous life. In his eyes, the protagonist was a clear obstacle in his path regarding the inheritance. Jivan, knowing the protagonist was from Busan, asked him what it was like coming all the way from Busan to Seoul, stating that it must be tough to adjust to everything. The hero simply asked who he was. Jivan shot back, asking why the protagonist was being so direct, considering he was older than him. And didn't people from Busan know what it meant to have manners? Muyak merely realized that this man was utterly childish and hadn't changed at all since the last life. This was a tremendous stroke of bad luck. Fed up, the hero silently placed the book back on the shelf. Then, with a glare of pure hostility, he advanced toward the man and told him it didn't matter if he was older. You're speaking informally the first time. We meet and you're still demanding respect. The young man immediately went into shock at how the protagonist had just addressed him. And the hero knew Jivan hadn't expected such a reaction, as it seemed to be the very first time anyone had ever shown him hostility. His father was the eldest son of a lone Shar king, and his mother, the eldest daughter of. He's the president of the Samsung Group. This means absolutely no one would dare disrespect him. Despite all that, Jivan wondered why this nobody was acting so arrogantly. He then told our protagonist that this whole place wasn't for someone like him. Afterwards, quite boldly, the man asked our hero how much he'd want to leave the place. He started by offering a whopping 100 million, claiming that he could live very comfortably with that. Our protagonist then recalled that previously, that fool had said the exact same thing. But back then, he couldn't say a word, so he acted like an idiot right now. Our hero sarcastically told his brother that he was oh so generous for just giving him mere crumbs of money. Jin's absolutely confused reaction made our protagonist explain that with that amount, they could barely afford sashimi at some mediocre restaurant. Jun then rudely said that now he finally understood why our protagonist didn't have parents, and just by looking at him, one could easily tell the state of his grandmother, who raised him alone. Absolutely furious, our hero then punched the door right in the direction of the young man. Now, he asked menacingly if this man wanted to get beaten by a country bumpkin who had supposedly never learned anything because he had no parents. Frightened, the jerk asked if our protagonist truly thought he could get away unscathed after doing all this to the eldest son of the Jin family. He then argued that he would tell absolutely everything to his grandfather. He was then interrupted by our protagonist, telling him to stop right there because he knew that grandson Jin of the Samsung Group family loved drugs and was resorting to smuggling, which could easily be reported in the news. Completely confused, the young man recklessly asked what exactly our protagonist was trying to say, and so he commented that he would tell him about the other children in the family. The very same people who threw that wild party at the hotel, a party that ultimately sent a girl to the hospital. Jivan still couldn't wrap his head around how the protagonist knew all about it. However, our hero declared that above all else, that boy was just a mere child. And what's more, he was confident he'd go down and spill everything to his grandfather. Muyak, knowing all the incidents that boy caused in his past life, was surprised to find that the troubles caused so far were nothing compared to what lay ahead. Confidently, the protagonist stated that if that man wanted to be treated like an older brother, he should start acting like one. That single sentence left Jin Won utterly stunned, ready to finally lie down. The prodigy told his brother to leave immediately because he needed his rest. He was already tired after all. Still incredibly nervous about the situation, Jin Won warned the protagonist that he should never speak of this to anyone else, because if he did, one of them would die right there. Then he asked if the protagonist understood what he was saying, with a superior smirk. The hero questioned if that was a request or a threat. Still terrified, his brother quickly said it was just a request. Already fed up with the conversation, the protagonist confirmed he understood and intended to keep his mouth shut. He then told his brother to get out of his room, fast. Jivan rushed out, slamming the door shut behind him. The hero pondered if Jinwon was truly the one who killed him in his past life. He just couldn't believe that he was defeated by someone like that. The night passed, and the very next day, our protagonist was walking around the house until he encountered his grandfather. His grandfather asked if he was leaving. The hero confirmed he was indeed leaving the house, bowing respectfully to his grandfather at that moment. And so, he bid farewell, still with his head bowed. The protagonist said he would come back to visit him more often. The grandfather simply said goodbye again, without another word. And with that, the protagonist finally left the house. Once out on the street, Muyak receives 100 million won from the director, who claims it's a personal gift from the president. Apparently, just owning shares in Hyun wasn't enough for him. And so, the director finally reveals that the password to that mysterious device is none other than our protagonist's mother's birthday. Broda wonders if this meticulous chaebol, Tae-seon, who always took such care with his belongings, is the same man witnessing this whole scene now. He tells the director to thank him on his behalf. However, the director insists Muyak should call him personally, certain his grandfather is waiting to speak with him. Time flies by in a flash, and our hero is already in his second year of high school. He's just transferred to a new class, while his friend, Myong-soo, continues to study diligently. Their other friend dedicates himself to the judo club. They're all doing their absolute best to keep their promise of getting into university. In Seoul, back in his classroom, the protagonist senses someone new is about to arrive. Just then, the teacher enters the room, introducing a new transfer student who just moved from Seoul. The mysterious boy introduces himself to the class, stating his name is Hong Jinpyo, and confirming he's from Seoul. And so, the protag immediately knows this type of person is a total beast. Later, the new student is seen eating with other students at a restaurant, smoking casually. He asks them who the head of their school is. The boys look confused, asking if he means a boss at school. They explain they don't really have one, but the closest to that title is the protagonist. Intrigued, the new student asks about Muyak, and the boys confirm that the protagonist is indeed the strongest in their second year. The students comment that last year, at the very start of the semester, the strongest students called out those with the most potential. When the seniors approached the protagonist's table, they realized he wasn't listening to anything they were saying because he was fast asleep. Boldly, one of the seniors taps our hero on the head. He quickly sits up, still drowsy, but manages to grasp the situation in an instant. The protag gives the senior a menacing look, then slams him to the ground with all his might, and in the blink of an eye, he'd already taken down all the troublemakers. With that, he just strolls back to his chair, declaring he'd go back to sleep, and no one better dare wake him up again. Back in the present, the student revealed that no senior ever dared to lay a hand on him after that legendary incident. However, he then concluded that he died and was now super focused on his studies. The newcomer, though, couldn't accept that. The strongest guy was just focused on studying when he was clearly the strongest. He scoffed, calling him arrogant, and said he'd love to play with him. The other students asked if he really planned to fight our hero, warning him not to pick a fight without a good reason, as our protagonist was on a completely different level. With that, the arrogant guy claimed that fighting well doesn't guarantee you'll always win. He then stated the students weren't siding with him just because he'd beaten them in a fight, but rather because his dad was the chief prosecutor. He then questioned what our protagonist's father did. The students reported that our hero had no parents, living only with his grandmother. However, they didn't know what his grandmother did for a living. The arrogant guy was totally surprised by the fact that our protagonist didn't even have parents, and promptly became full of himself. Now back at school, our protagonist was chatting with his friend, mentioning that Han-sung had returned to the sports club after resting for quite a while. He noted that Han-sung was dead set on getting into a physical education college by following a super strict diet. Now, our hero's friend asked if he'd heard about the new transfer student, Jinpyo, who'd come all the way from Seoul. Apparently, he was an annoying guy who spoke in the local dialect. Our protagonist immediately recognized this guy, the chief prosecutor's son, who used his father's influence to run the school however he pleased. His classmate added that since the seniors were on a trip, Jinpyo was now forming his own crew, making even the freshmen act like gangsters, practically turning the school into his personal playground. Suddenly, they spot that annoying kid they were just talking about. As he passes, Jinpyo immediately senses the protagonist's presence. And the same goes for Muayel. He's already on high alert, a serious tone in his voice. The protagonist sternly warns Meng Xian, never get mixed up with those guys. But Meng Xian claims he's worrying over nothing, saying there's no reason at all to get involved. But once again, the protagonist stresses that he needs to stay far away from them. His friend then questions why he cares so much, wondering aloud if they somehow knew his weakness. As the bullies walk away, the protagonist remembers his past with a dear friend. He recalls something terrible happening to Myung-soon. Regarding this incident, his friend reported that while Myung-soon was fighting, he seriously injured his leg, making him unable to walk ever again. Furious, he adds that it was all the fault of that transferred student, because he used his father's influence to never face any consequences. The protagonist was utterly frustrated with the whole situation, but only claimed it had nothing to do with him, and that he just wanted to focus on his studies. He deeply regretted those past events. Therefore, he didn't want to get involved in anything annoying. Again, just like he ignored Myung-soon, his closest friend back then. Now, however, he was determined never to give up on the things that were precious to him. Later, in the classroom, while the short guy was studying, he was approached by the new student and the bullies, who walked in with him. He asks if Meng Xian was close to the student, named Muai Hyuk, claiming he heard that he was very good at fighting. The short guy quickly argues, telling him not to worry, as Muai Hyuk was just focused on his studies now, so he had nothing to do with him. Jinpyo is surprised and asks if the protagonist had any problem with Jinpyo taking over the school. And once again, Myung-soo confirms, arrogantly gesturing with his finger, declaring he owned the entire school, since Muik had nothing to do with it. But Jinpyo simply retorts that the protagonist infuriated him to no end, now absolutely boiling with rage. The shorter guy furiously demands what the protagonist did, and why he insisted on provoking someone who just wanted to study in peace. Now, the bully opens up, admitting he hates it, when people thought some punk was better than him. He then points to the bully next to him as an example, claiming they seemed more afraid of Mia than they were of him. As usual, Manson warns him not to provoke the protagonist, and one of the bullies doesn't appreciate his tone, calling him a loser and telling him to watch his words, since without Muyu, he was nothing and would just *T his pants. But before the bully could even act, the arrogant guy stops him, declaring, but the real issue was whenever he wanted something, he got it. And whenever he wanted to break something, he broke it, not understanding a thing. The protagonist's friend asks if he's retarded, or something like that, and quickly, one of the bullies slams his head against the table with full force. The bully then declares that all of this happened because he was close to that bastard named Muyak, so he shouldn't take it personally. And so, he orders them to let Ming soon go. While the protagonist was deep in his studies, one of his classmates rushed towards him, exclaiming they had a huge problem. He reported that Ming Su had been caught by Jean Pyo, who said the protagonist had to go to the band room. And without a moment's hesitation, the protagonist dashed off to rescue his friend, realizing that no matter how much he tried to avoid it, this meant it was all going to happen again. On his way to confront Jean Pyo, the protagonist encountered one of his allies, who questioned what they meant by Myung-soo being caught by someone named Jean Pyo. The hero tried to calm his friend down, saying he would take care of everything, but he wasn't about to just stand by, while Myung-soo was taken by some bastard. Our hero mused on the fact that, after a year of intense training, Yun-soo was now a promising talent in Busan, and if he got tangled in school violence, he might seriously have to give up his dreams. Muyak urged his friend to chill out, since he was an athlete and school trouble would totally screw up his college admissions. But once again, Hyung-sung argued back at our hero, saying college didn't matter to him right now. Because if anything happened to Myang-soo, he swore, he'd definitely deal with that scumbag himself. Losing his patience quickly, our hero raised his voice, explaining he had big plans for the future and would absolutely need his friend's help for them. So he earnestly pleaded with him to let him handle it. With that, our hero got ready for battle, grabbing a broom handle and telling Kong's son to focus on not letting anyone get near them, no matter who it was, even a teacher. His partner was stunned, asking if he was really going to handle everything all by himself, and our hero replied that his partner probably forgot. He was Kim Myung-yuk. Upon arriving at the room, Myung-yuk came face to face with several students, ready to fight, with Jin Pyo lurking around his friend. Upon seeing our hero's arrival, the scoundrel declared they weren't joking when they'd said that if he messed with Myung-soo, Muyak would definitely show his face. He then added that if our hero hadn't shown up, he would have snapped Myang-soo's ankle. Barely believing what he was seeing, a protagonist friend asked what he was doing there. So our hero argued with Pio, saying if he had something to discuss, he should come directly to him, instead of dragging his friends into it. The scumbag burst out laughing, trying to recall why he always pulled stunts like this, until he remembered that he did it simply because he thought it would be fun. Our hero was getting increasingly irritated, and now ordered him to let Myung-soo go immediately, promising he'd play with him instead, making everything much more fun. The scoundrel was utterly disgusted by our hero's words. He then asked if they were filming a movie about the loyalty of Busan boys. After that, he called his henchmen to him, but they were clearly apprehensive, already losing his patience. Jin Pyo raised his voice at his henchmen's disobedience, asking if they even knew who his father was. He argued that if his father lifted a finger, he would make sure they spent their entire lives in prison, along with all the consequences. And thus, the order was given for everyone to attack the protagonist. The first unfortunate soul, who tried to charge at the hero, received a blow to the throat that destabilized him. Two more delinquents charged at the hero, but he defended himself and took care of them easily, kicking one away, but caught by surprise. He received a hit to the back, but quickly retaliated with his broom handle, hitting the villain in the face. The students were becoming increasingly frightened, and Jin Pyo was impatient, telling them to bring the prota to him. The conflict escalated, with blood flying everywhere, and ended with the protagonist defeating everyone present. Thus, the spoiled brat fell into a deep state of shock. Quickly, the scoundrel pointed a knife at Mangsu's neck, telling the protag to stay back, or he'd stab his partner. However, the hero wasn't falling for his empty threats, and swiftly landed a punch to his face, sending him flying, even though he was on the ground. The scoundrel didn't let go of his ego, and said that the protag wouldn't get away with it, because his father was the chief prosecutor. And so he explained more clearly that his father had the power to make anyone rot in prison for the rest of their lives. The protag didn't care, and said that a prosecutor was useless when his fists were closer to the law. And so he begins a series of punches, saying that all of this was for kidnapping his friend, Myung-soo, and for interrupting his precious study time. And finally, the protagonist retaliates by breaking the ankle of that scoundrel, claiming revenge for Myung-soo's broken leg. The scoundrel pleaded with him to stop, but it was no use. But our protagonist was already consumed by rage, and so he delivered on his promise of retribution. Soon enough, our hero found himself locked up in a police station. Then, his friend's uncle suddenly appeared, asking for him. He explained that Myung-soo had let him know that by saving him, our hero had been arrested. The uncle assured him that Myung-soo wasn't actually hurt. However, the man revealed they had a major problem, because our hero was caught fighting the wrong person, the prosecutor's son. And even though he was a police officer, there wasn't much he could do in this particular case. So, the protagonist requested one small favor, and the officer was willing to grant it. It was a quick phone call that would only take a moment. Night had already fallen when suddenly, a furious man stormed into the police station, demanding to know where the protagonist was. As soon as he found him, our hero came face to face with the prosecutor, who immediately asked if he was the one who broke his son's leg. The protagonist, completely unafraid, declared that it happened during a fight, in which he was all alone, while on the other side there were over 10 people. He then questioned why he was the only one arrested. The prosecutor was clearly not satisfied with our hero's words. He immediately ordered that the protagonist be taken for interrogation, but the officers present refused, as he was still a minor. Still, the prosecutor, Four Eyes, insisted they take the protagonist, claiming he would handle things himself. With that declaration, the prosecutor was confident. He knew exactly how to deal with delinquents. Like our protagonist, in a private room, the prosecutor told Muyak he was quite famous that day. Four Eyes also revealed that Muyak's teacher had told him everything, including that he was no different from a gang member, causing a lot of trouble over the last year. Our protagonist, though, harbored a supreme hatred for his abusive teacher. The hero explained that he had no intention of hurting anyone and was only defending himself. The prosecutor, however, was already furious with the whole situation. He flat out refused to accept the protagonist's answer, so he demanded once again why he'd done it. Muyak then explained his side, saying his classmate had been dragged away by Jinpyo, and when he went searching, the gang ambushed him. Left with no choice, he had to fight back. Still unsatisfied, the prosecutor dramatically removed his belt, declaring that this wouldn't be enough. And now, he was dead set on teaching our protagonist a lesson. He ordered the two men standing behind the protagonist to hold him down, with our hero now restrained. The cowardly prosecutor unleashed a barrage of punches. He repeatedly demanded why the protagonist had done it, and continued to savagely beat him. However, Muyak remained unyielding, insisting it was all purely self-defense. The prosecutor then sneered, claiming there was still a spark of fire inside that delinquent, and that with his very next punch, he would extinguish that last flame. And once again, the protagonist was mercilessly beaten. The prosecutor's men merely stood by and watched, distressed by the devastating spectacle before them. After all this brutal chaos, both men were exhausted, and the protagonist looked absolutely terrible. Even after so much beating, still not satisfied, the prosecutor questioned him once again, demanding why our protagonist did that. Then Muyak, struggling to even speak, repeated again that it was all in self-defense. Still insistent and unyielding, the Four Eyes declared that the more Muyak resisted, the worse things would get for him. And so, he stated he would ask just one more time. He accused our hero of attacking his son, and with a weapon first. But Muyak shot back, claiming he was wrong, because his son was carrying a knife. With even more blazing fury, the prosecutor declared that this was bringing him back to his old days. And with that, he demanded the protagonist be tied up. His men were a bit reluctant to obey such an order, but under the prosecutor's intense pressure, they finally complied. Now, our protagonist then found himself, with his hands stretched out, on the table, tied down to a chair. The prosecutor sneered he had dug his own grave. He was certain of it, and shouldn't be ashamed. With the four-eyed prosecutor and his crew, he was about to jam a pin right under the protagonist's nail. The scoundrel was practically drooling for it, but before he could even try, Wyatt burst out laughing, completely stunning the prosecutor. The scoundrel demanded why the hero was laughing, thinking he'd lost his mind from pure terror. The protagonist then stated that Jinpyo and his father were disturbingly similar, truly like father, like son. He added that both of them just loved to wave around their little, pathetic tools. The prosecutor, furious at Mwayip's insolent attitude, demanded he be restrained so he could attack him. But to everyone's utter shock, a man burst through the door, loudly calling for the prosecutor. Still seething, the four-eyed scoundrel snapped that this man was interrupting his important business, and suddenly, another tall man strode into the room with a dead serious expression. That man was Yin Chong-ho, The chief prosecutor of the Busan district, the four-eyed scoundrel, wondered aloud why Mr. Yun was even there. Without wasting a single second, the chief prosecutor slapped Four Eyes across the face, screaming, "You bastard!" He demanded to know what he was doing with the minor. He continued, declaring that if this scoundrel wanted to die, he should do it alone, without dragging anyone else down. He then questioned if he even knew that the chief prosecutor was almost headed for ruin because of him. Still utterly confused, the scoundrel dared to ask why the chief prosecutor was doing all of this. Terrified, the tall man roared back if the scoundrel even knew who the grandfather of that arrested punk was. He rapidly stated that if he knew, he wouldn't be pulling this stunt. And so that tall, bald man revealed it was President Chun of Pyeongchangdong, who was that kid's grandfather. Connecting the dots, the cowardly prosecutor realized it was President Chun Tae-san, and utterly bewildered, wondered why he would be involved. And, pointing directly at the protagonist, the chief prosecutor finally says, "This student was none other than President Chien's grandson," and this cowardly scoundrel, panicking, anxiously stared at our protagonist's face. He saw a mocking expression there, and suddenly came to his senses, falling into complete panic. After all that chaos and confusion, our protagonist now found himself at his grandfather's house. Inside, the two were deep in conversation, their tones gravely serious. The old man questioned how this entire ordeal had unfolded. The protagonist explained he'd sought his help because the prosecutor was conducting an unfair, power-abusing investigation. With a serious gaze, the bearded man asked, couldn't our hero have avoided this? Muyak then explained that they'd dared to involve his loved ones. He simply couldn't let that slide. So he crushed them, ensuring they'd never bother him again. But he concluded by declaring that he never wants those around him to suffer because of him. Therefore, it was his absolute resolve to protect all his friends and family. With fierce determination, he stated this was his unwavering way of life. The old man merely observed, reflecting deeply but saying nothing aloud. From that, the protagonist admitted he already owed his grandfather a tremendous debt. But when it came to protecting his loved ones, he would truly do anything possible. Still grumpy, the old man asked what our protagonist would have done if he hadn't stepped in to help. He stated that his life could have easily ended then and there. The hero declared that, in such a case, his relationship with the old man simply couldn't go any further. This bold statement utterly surprised the great loan shark. With a grave face, the protagonist then added that if his grandfather hadn't helped him when he had the chance, he wouldn't see a place for him in his family any longer. And with that final, resolute sentence, the old man suddenly burst into booming laughter. Soon after, he declared that the protagonist was absolutely right, saying a true man should never back down and must utilize every method at his disposal. The protagonist reflected that his words had been serious. However, he remembered this as his grandfather's philosophy of life. For his past life, the formidable loan shark taught his grandson that, in unavoidable situations, he must utterly crush his enemies, leaving no room for their return. A half-hearted victory will only invite them to attack again. He then concluded, stating that if the protagonist wished to make someone an ally, he should embrace them fully and remove any lingering difficulties. With that, the old man called the director closer and inquired about the situation in Busan. Mr. He reported that Prosecutor Han was under internal investigation for his involvement in torture and manipulation, while Prosecutor Yin awaited the old man's decision. Without further ado, the great loan shark then asked how things were progressing at the school. The director quickly revealed that a prosecutor's son had been expelled, and all involved students had left. Moreover, Muyu's abusive teacher was also expelled. After hearing these reports, the old man inquired if the protagonist was satisfied with the outcome. However, Muyu had one more favor to ask of his grandfather. It was then revealed that the protagonist wished to take care of Prosecutor Yun's case. Still confused, his grandfather asked why he desired to do so. Later that day, the director and the prosecutor met at a restaurant. Inside, Mr. Hat asked what he planned to do about Prosecutor Hong. Still visibly frightened, the bald young man stated that the scoundrel was currently under investigation, and to set an example, he would face punishment. The director stated that throughout the entire process, the young master's name must never be mentioned. Afterward, he mentioned that someone else was present, interested in speaking with the prosecutor. The director then opened the room's door, revealing the protagonist. The two were already seated, facing each other in tense silence. The prosecutor immediately starts apologizing for their last encounter, insisting it was entirely his fault, and swearing it would never happen again. But Moo-hyuk, unfazed, tells him to drop the formalities and states he understands the prosecutor's predicament. The balding prosecutor feared that the notorious loan shark would resent Moo-hyuk for being his grandson. So, Moo-hyuk then reveals that he specifically requested this meeting, knowing the prosecutor was in a tough spot due to his actions and wanted to apologize. The prosecutor begins to get agitated, insisting there was no need for an apology, as everything had been his fault from the start, for mishandling his subordinate. So Moo-hyuk says he will have to deliver a sincere apology from the prosecutor to his grandfather. However, the protagonist was eager to shift topics and quickly change the subject. Moo-hyuk then asks if the prosecutor would grant him a favor for a future date, unconditionally. He explains this favor isn't meant to harm him, but because only he, in his position, could do it. Yet still nervous, the balding prosecutor agrees, saying he'd be happy to help if it was something only he could do. Hearing this, the protagonist says he'll pass his apologies to his grandfather and tells him not to take responsibility for this case. Now, feeling more relieved, the prosecutor says he understands and thanks him, saying he feels lighter after their talk. Moo-hyuk says he hopes to meet him in better circumstances and comments that he heard he'd be promoted to Seoul. However, Moo-hyuk, already getting up, says he has to head to classes as he's missed too many days since the incident. With all the conversation, the prosecutor had forgotten that Moo-hyuk, he was just a student, and he expresses his hope to meet him again in the future. Finally, our protagonist leaves the room and heads off to his next commitments. The old man reflects, thinking he was very skilled in dealing with people, especially considering he was just a high school student. After everything that happened, the protagonist's student life went on without a hitch. He continued studying diligently, as usual, and his friends are also doing their best, striving for a better future. Time passed with news of war. The Olympics took place, and a new political position was elected. And so, the university entrance exam arrived, and our protagonist successfully took the academic proficiency test. Meanwhile, in the great mansion of the Lung Shark, director Hay sets out to report something to the old man. He says he checked the protagonist's admission report through a university professor, piquing the old man's curiosity. And as soon as the great loan shark picks up the report, he's utterly surprised by what he sees. The scene cuts to a large crowd of reporters, swarming around the protagonist, announcing that he passed first in the admission test, achieving a perfect score. They asked how he accomplished this feat. He had achieved a perfect score of 340 points, setting a new record in that region. And many reporters asked what his secret technique was, and if he received private tutoring. However, the hero reveals that he never had private lessons and studied only using books. One of those present at the scene tells Moo-hyuk to give some words of encouragement to those who would take the exam next. And so, formally, the prodigy says that studying was the easiest thing in the world. Returning to the old man's mansion, he was greatly pleased with the result. On one night, after all these events, the boys were at a nightclub, and they celebrated their achievements and their friendship. The protagonist was annoyed by his friends shouting, but he argued that they had studied for 3 years. Looks like it's time for some fun. Nan's son proudly announced his father owned the place, so he'd handle all the drinks and the reservation. And our hero reflected that, in his past life, he'd downed countless drinks, including the finest whiskeys on the market. So, he decided to join them for a drink, too. It had been a long time since our protagonist had enjoyed a drink. and he wondered what concoction awaited his throat. But upon sipping, he realized the whiskey was fake. Myung's son, however, was already wasted, claiming the sensation burned through his body, and questioning how it hadn't killed him. The protagonist merely says it wasn't bad at all, even saying it was like water. Thus, he decided he should act normal, since this place belonged to his friend's father. Suddenly, a young man arrives, introducing a stunning girl to Myung's son, claiming she was the most beautiful among his clients. He ended up telling him to take good care of her. But our hero's two friends were already blushing. The girls were already sitting with the boys, chatting. One of them asks Mieka's age and claims she is 21. Young's son was already excited and says they are 20 years old and were accepted into college just a few days ago. The girl then asks which university, but just as he was about to speak, the protagonist quickly silences him, claiming they be attending a small college in Seoul. Suddenly, some shady characters approached the boys' table, asking what they were doing. The scoundrel wondered why the women hadn't returned after going to the bathroom, only to be confronted by them, leaving with younger guys. The girl complained that she could no longer go to that place because the crowd was absolutely horrible. She explained she'd left the room without a single drink, and that the man should have noticed. She didn't like his piggish face. The scoundrel exclaimed he was going crazy and wondered what that idiot was doing. The protagonist was already on high alert, being careful not to get into unnecessary trouble, and figured it would be best to leave quickly. With that, our hero stands up from the table and announces they're leaving. He then apologizes. But the moment the protagonist looks at his friend, Myung-soo, telling him to get up, he realizes something is seriously wrong. Suddenly, the kid completely freaks out and starts shouting frantically. He screams that he doesn't care about anything anymore. The thugs, who were already harassing them, are now absolutely furious at Myung-soo's outburst. Myung-yuk is deeply worried about his drunken friend. However, Myung-soo sees absolutely nothing wrong, believing they're just there to drink. Myung-soo then declares he'd ruin his father's business by doing this. But the protagonist firmly states it's enough. They need to leave quickly, but as they start to go, a glass is violently hurled to the ground. The portly thug who threw it snarls, asking where they think they're going. A staff member tries to calm him, explaining that those boys are the son and friends of the establishment's owner. He adds they were just there to celebrate his graduation, but ignoring him completely, the fat man violently shoves the staff member to the ground, calling him a bastard. With that, the scoundrel starts viciously kicking the poor guy, demanding if he thinks this is a joke. Witnessing the horrifying scene, all the customers in the place start fleeing. The suited guys with the fat man desperately try to stop him, questioning why he's acting like this. One man asks Lee if he doesn't know. They've taken over Napadon. They've been solving things with that guy, providing them whiskey for a long time now. The protagonist was already aware of the person selling the counterfeit whiskey. The owner of the place says his son is still immature and caused problems, thus apologizing and promising he'll take care of everything. Liam Sue's father tells the boys to get out of there quickly and for his son to wait for him at home. The hero, downcast, urges them to hurry. The fat scoundrel is still yelling, demanding where they're going, but the owner tells him to leave them alone, to sort it out and resolve it among themselves. Suddenly, the main group hears the sharp sound of slap and immediately grows alert. The obese scoundrel asks if Mr. Lee is mocking him, then adds that he'd always respected him for being older, but he shouldn't act this way. Now, the roles have reversed. The fat man declares the old man is being outsmarted by a younger guy. With that, he starts viciously kicking him, taunting that he should have treated him better when he was being nice. Furious at seeing his father beaten bloody, Myung-soo charges at the scoundrel, but to no avail, being easily subdued by the giant and thrown to the ground immediately after. Now, holding the kid by the hair, the fat man vows to teach him a harsh lesson, declaring that if he messes with someone he doesn't know, he will be beaten senseless. Now on his knees, the owner of the place begs, Mr. Big, please stop and let my son go. Ironically, The pig sneers that a father's love for his son is making him weep. With that, he releases Myung-soo and moves to slap the owner, declaring, "It's as you wished." But quickly, he is stopped dead in his tracks, his arm suddenly immobilized. Muyak has finally intervened, saying it's enough and he's gone too far. The big guy doesn't understand how his arm was stopped. The hero states that no matter how angry he is, he should never hit a father in front of his child, and adds that he's already done enough and should just stop. Still frustrated, the scoundrel wonders if kids these days have no fear anymore. And now, moving to try and hit Muyak, he asks if he doesn't know who he is, acting that way in front of him when he tries to hit the protagonist, who easily dodges. He is surprised, but shows no reaction. At that moment, the scoundrel's friends are already ready to face the protagonist. But suddenly, one of his men goes flying past him. As the big brute tries to process what just happened, he receives a brutally hard slap to the face. And just like that, he hit the ground, completely dazed. Meanwhile, Muyak watched on, a mysterious glint in his eyes. Then, a figure waved directly at Muyak. And to Muyak's surprise, it was Park Dong-soo, the infamous punk himself. The one our protagonist first ran into at the hospital was now here, ready to help them out. He then asked if he'd had fun while he was away, staring down the scoundrel with a smirk. Park mused how that idiot hadn't been caught yet, thinking he was such a ridiculously sneaky criminal. So much so that even the police couldn't find him. Upon seeing Dong-soo, the brute's reaction was swift, to declare that this was his territory, right here, right now. And with that, the punk strolled right up to the scoundrel, stating emphatically that Nampadong hadn't belonged to him before, completely hostile towards his shocked opponent. Dong-soo simply declared, "I'm here now," and then seriously told him to get lost, before he completely smashed his face in, which instantly made the brute break out in a cold sweat. He then turned, warmly greeting the protagonist, asking him how he had been doing, and saying it was truly good to see him again, beaming with happiness at the hero's presence. Park then invited him to grab a drink of soju. In a private room, just the two of them to talk. Dong-soo commented that he'd caught the news, where our protagonist was ranked #1 in the entire country, adding that he definitely didn't expect that from him. Muyak then asked when he had made his return, and Park replied that it had been quite some time, but he was carefully taking his time to discreetly reclaim their old territories bit by bit. The protagonist then asked if the delinquent was now managing this area, and he replied with a firm yes, because he declared all of it belonged to them. Despite all that, he hadn't faced any major fights to take them back. Dong-soo, turning serious, commented that his last gang had been completely wiped out, and he added that if the protagonist hadn't warned him, he would have been stuck in prison for many years. And so, he suddenly offered his heartfelt thanks. Park then directly asked the protagonist what he wanted from him at that very moment. Following that, he explained that his life had been saved by our hero, and that he should absolutely repay him for it, since he couldn't possibly live indebted to him. The protagonist offered a faint smile, hinting that he was fully aware of the situation. The protagonist then questioned the delinquent, asking how long he thought it would take to seize complete control of the entire Busan area. Dong-soo, not quite understanding, asked if that was what he was being questioned about. He then asked what the protagonist wanted, since the protagonist was worrying about someone else's business. But the protagonist replied, utterly serious, that that was precisely what he wanted right now. Park responded that it would take around 6 months, at most a year, since everyone else had been arrested, when only people of little relevance remained. The protagonist simply replied, telling him to take control of Busan swiftly and to make sure to bribe the police and prosecutors. He also advised to handle things carefully and warned them not to get involved with drugs, as there would soon be an unprecedented crackdown. Even with connections, it would be incredibly difficult to manage. With that, the protagonist told him to prepare for their transition from the shadows into the light of day. The delinquent scoffed at the protagonist's last phrase, finding the idea utterly ironic. He then stated that people like them never truly appeared in the light of day. He claimed they'd only find someone like him emerging from the shadows and starting a whole new war. The protagonist commented that it was regrettable and asked if he would obey all the laws. Then what was even the point of being a gangster? Park argued that the CEO gangs had already started becoming legitimate corporations, and Busan needed to hurry. Otherwise, the Seoul Games would undoubtedly prevail. The hero told him to hire competent lawyers and formally establish his corporation. Then, after taking full control of Busan, they should advance to Seoul. Dong-soo was astonished to hear him mention Seoul. He excitedly argued that it wasn't nearly that easy, as that place was a brutal battlefield, where people from all over the country would come to fight, but calmly. Our protagonist told him not to worry, saying he'd help and to trust him, as he'd handle all the preparations. Now, calmer, the delinquent admits it was ridiculous, but he still felt utterly convinced by the protagonist's powerful speech. Now, much more animated, the gangster concedes it didn't sound bad, and that he'd try to take control of Seoul. They helped themselves to another round, filling their glasses with expensive whiskey. Muiyak then stated that there was one crucial condition for all this to happen. He reveals that throughout this entire process, his name and true identity must never be revealed, nor his connection to Park Dong-soo. Under any circumstances, soon after, he swallows a gulp of his whiskey and reflects that he couldn't have anyone knowing who he truly was, not until he confronted the Jean family. Meanwhile, inside his grandfather's lavish mansion, at the president's house, the old man was engrossed in a newspaper article about our protagonist, proudly stating that studying was the easiest thing. He bursts into joyous laughter, beaming with happiness for his grandson. The director beside him asks if he's pleased, and the old man replies, yes, because in addition to a family member entering Korea University, he was also among the absolute best in the country. The loan shark mentioned he felt so invigorated after talking to the old man from the Samsung group on duty that morning. The old man knew they usually belittled his family, thinking that his family was nothing more than ignorant people with money, and they always bragged about their children. The director then states that those very same people who said that also came to ask the president for loans. The old man knows this to be undeniably true, as they belittled him behind his back. But when they desperately needed something, they came begging for hours. He recounts that he didn't even finish elementary school because he had to start working early, and that his children weren't exactly stellar students either. Without his money, they wouldn't have made it to college. The director then mentions Jisoo, the president's second daughter, who got into Korea University last year. This led the president to gift 1% of Samsung Electronics shares. As a gift, the white-bearded man agrees, remarking that Jisoo was a smart child. He then states he really likes Muyuk and wonders how great he would be if he weren't his grandson, but rather a direct descendant of the Chun family. Now the old man asks what the news says about the newly elected president, and the director replies that he's focused on selecting the committee members. The suited young man interjects that the president only secured parts of 2 positions. He doesn't understand why. The director continues, explaining that it's now a civilian government, and asking for too much would be strange. However, the old man had already understood, and tells him not to say anything more. At that moment, the old man asks which positions the director thought were best. He replies that placing someone in charge of economic and political affairs would be good. The loan shark asks him to explain more about the political affairs. The shaved-head man explains that political affairs would manipulate the police and the prosecution. That would be very useful. In light of this, the president says they'll do that, as I'll go directly to the Blue House. And the director agrees. Now, the old man asks what Suhan and Suman have been doing these days. The director reveals that the second chief is preparing a new venture, but there's a problem. He reports that this new business is linked to gangsters. Upon hearing this, the old man freaks out as he hates gangsters. Frightened, the big loan shark asks if most gangs haven't been detained for a war on crime, but the man in black explains they were a gang that had been secretly expanding. The old man was already familiar with this gang's history, known as the Blue Wind Society. He demands to know what the hell they were doing, getting involved with them. The director replies that they had gotten involved in the slot machine business. The loan shark is furious, asking if that was truly the best they could do. Just gambling. The man with the shaved head reveals that Congressman Kim had been bribed with his father-in-law, leading the licensing process, thus securing a lot of fun. Still disgusted, the loan shark remarks that he should be doing tasks for those damned in-laws, just as he had warned them previously, not to get involved with that society. Seriously, the director asks how they should deal with it. But the old man replies that for now, it would be best to just keep an eye on them, to ensure they don't cause any problems. The white-haired man now reflected that he should never have borrowed power from the Blue Wind Society. In his youth, he was now clearly scared by this fact, but also relieved. He mused that all of this was the result of his own karma, and assured that before he died, he would break this chain of ill fate. At the loan shark's mansion, the atmosphere was pleasant under the sunny sky. At the entrance, a young man was calling out for his grandfather. This well-postured young man was Miek, who had returned. His grandfather welcomed him with a warm smile, saying it was good to have him back. Face to face with him, he revealed that he had been waiting for him. The two were now sitting in the main room, as the old man inquired if the hero had found a place to live in Seoul. The loan shark offered to get him an apartment near Prota's college and even hire a maid, so he could focus solely on his studies. But the hero admitted that he'd prefer to stay at his grandfather's house, if he didn't mind. He continued, saying that ever since his first visit to that house, he'd always dreamed of living there. He argued that his mother had lived there as a child, so he'd feel closer to her by staying. And he added that he wanted to see his grandfather more often. The old man was utterly delighted to hear that, remarking that he knew just how to say what he wanted to hear, and told him he could do as he wished. In his past life, he only ever visited that house when summoned, and never participated in any gatherings, always treated like an outsider. But now, he had just been accepted into the law school, at the nation's best university, a tremendous source of pride for his grandfather, so naturally he would be treated differently. Sipping his tea, the old man curiously asked the hero to tell him he had died having fulfilled his promise of being accepted into Korea University's law school 3 years ago, and the old man wanted to know what he would like to receive as a gift. The protagonist gave a confident smile, knowing he had his grandfather exactly where he wanted him. He said his grandpa must be very curious, since he'd called him right after the graduation ceremony, and the old man replied that the protagonist's achievements weren't something that could be achieved just by wishing for them. The old man countered that there was no way not to be curious, since he had worked so incredibly hard for his studies, and now he wanted to know what he truly desired. In response, the protagonist revealed that he'd like to learn more about his grandfather's work. With this revelation, the old man and the director were utterly stunned, unable to utter a word, still in disbelief. The old man asked if that was truly what he wanted, if it was about learning how he operated. And with that, Muya confirmed that, yes, that was exactly what he desired. The whitehead asked if he was saying this, fully aware of the kind of work he did, knowing private loans weren't just about lending, and simply collecting money. The confident hero admitted he didn't know much about it, but he was certain his current work wasn't ordinary at all. That's why he was eager to learn more. The old man, still bewildered, was lost in thought for a moment. Muyak pondered what he needed to seize his grandfather's fortune and exact his revenge on everyone. He wondered what he should ask for. He weighed his options: money, people or properties, or assets that would skyrocket in value. But using his knowledge of the future, making money wasn't a problem. However, if he accumulated wealth that way, he'd eventually be exposed, and his uncles would try to control him. As it stood, the prodigal lacked the strength or power to protect himself, and the funds he needed to fight his uncles were hidden. So his plan now was to pretend, to learn by working with his grandfather, win his heart, and then manipulate him as he pleased. The notorious loan shark wanted to confirm once again if his grandson truly wanted to learn his business with him. Soon after, he asked if this was a reward for a bet that had lasted 3 years, since he could ask for something much bigger that he could have right now. The protagonist countered that learning to fish, instead of just receiving the fish ready-made, will be much better for him. Lowering his head seriously, the old man reflected for a moment. Now, he asked the director what he thought. The man in black said it was too early. They should wait for Muyak to graduate from university. Impatiently, Muyak said he didn't have a strong attachment to academia and wanted to start right. At that very moment, the old man adopted a serious tone and said that Muyak was going to Korea University. He asked if he wasn't trying to become a judge or a lawyer, but the hero revealed that merely entering university, this was simply a means to prove his ability to his grandfather. Muyak declared he aimed to become someone with immense power, just like his grandfather. Hearing this left the seasoned loan shark deep in thought, and he uttered not another word. However, still serious, the protagonist then stated that if his grandfather wished for him to become a lawyer, he would follow that path, as he was ready to take the bar exam at any moment. The white, bearded man stated that the protagonist implied, by simply taking the bar exam, he expected everything to be handed to him on a silver platter. Director mused that this man was truly unpredictable, and he wondered if he possessed far greater capabilities than imagined. Now, the formidable loan shark made up his mind, declaring the protagonist should move forward and try it. The president ordered the director to teach his work to the young hero. Now, inside a closed room, sitting at a table, were the man in black and the protagonist. The director began by explaining that the president was deeply involved in the loan business, revealing these were private loans, or as they say, loan sharking. And even though they were private, they were still operated strictly within the law. Thus, the director instructed the protagonist to study the law thoroughly, as they needed foolproof guarantees. These guarantees could be real estate or various types of securities. They also accepted stocks, but only those that could significantly impact a company's shares. The president personally dealt with large conglomerates, assisting them with immense funds, stating that banks couldn't handle such operations. They were moving tens of billions daily. The protagonist reflected that at that time, the large banks weren't as developed, and Myeongdong, along with his grandfather, were practically the center of the financial business. Now, the director instructed him to learn the negotiation process, where the president handles the conglomerates directly, and for that, he'd have to dive into several books on the subject. A massive pile of books and documents is promptly placed before our protagonist, leaving him a little taken aback. The man in the sharp suit explains these are the books, contracts, and legal materials pertaining to their current guarantees. He then instructs our protagonist to read all of them over 3 days and then send a summary. Our protagonist felt a touch embarrassed, since he already knew all of it, but still had to pretend. A week later, at the old man's lavish mansion, he inquired about the director's thoughts on our protagonist. After teaching him, the shaved head man reveals that our protagonist was capable of seeing the flow of money and uncovering hidden patterns in countless documents. In his opinion, it would normally take a lifetime of experience to gain these skills, but the hero developed them, as if he'd known everything from the start. The old man, upon hearing this, tried to keep his composure, but he was convinced his grandson possessed immense talent. During this discussion, the director reveals they'd already found corporate representatives, and with that, our protagonist didn't seem intimidated in the slightest, acting completely natural as he continued. He states he didn't need to help the hero at all. These words were pure music to the old man's ears. In light of this, the director asserts that our protagonist could master all the tasks. He could teach him in just a few days. Suddenly, the great loan shark asks if he could put Myuk in charge of the Myeongdong operations. The shaved head man is startled and questions if it wasn't a bit too early. He also wonders if the Myeongdong bosses would even recognize our protagonist. The white-bearded man, confident, argues that he'd entrusted his own work to the protagonist. He then questions why he would need their recognition. The director counters, stating that even Presidents Shin, Sumin, and Suin struggled to handle these individuals, and questioned if the young master was truly capable. The president declared that eventually he would have to confront them. It would be better to do so sooner, rather than later. He then ordered all banking records from Myeongdong gathered. Meanwhile, the old man was incredibly anxious to see what the protagonist truly was capable of, and if he would prove useful to their cause. Elsewhere, in a lavish corporate building, one of his sons received a call. It was revealed to him that the protagonist was headed to Myeongdong. He hung up the phone silently, looking deeply doubtful. He then began to gaze thoughtfully at the city from the top of his building, reflecting on his father's intentions. With that young man in the sprawling city of Seoul, traffic flowed smoothly and the sunlight was pleasant. Inside the car, the protagonist and the director. The protagonist asked what kind of business the director had in Myeongdong. He replied that the 5 major banks were concentrated in Myeongdong. The loan market had formed in that area, with the primary presidents of conglomerates overseeing it. However, Chung Sumin and Suin handled other, smaller areas. The director continued, explaining that besides those two, there were 4 individuals, known as the 4 heads of Myeongdong. They were the largest private lenders in Myeongdong, moving tens and hundreds of millions daily. He then added that the president trusted them with his money as an investor. So, the protagonist needed to check if they were managing all the funds properly. Then, with a more serious tone, Mr. Hess said that those individuals had been in the business for a long time, so dealing with them wouldn't be easy. Even so, the protagonist remained unfazed, stating it was no problem, as he would have to face them one day anyway. And the sooner he learned, the better. The director is stunned by our hero's bold response. He's left utterly speechless in that moment. The loan shark industry was teeming with ruthless individuals, feared even by the most hardened gangsters. And among these fearsome figures were the 4 notorious loan shark bosses of Myeongdong. These very same individuals had held their powerful positions for decades, earning the absolute trust of the legendary loan shark Chung. That's precisely why they were such formidable individuals. However, our protagonist had also grown up in this cutthroat world in his past life, and had even met his end because of it. Upon finally reaching their destination, the boys are greeted by one of the 4 infamous loan shark bosses, who extends a surprisingly friendly welcome. He exclaims he'd been eagerly anticipating their visit, then asks if the president is doing well. The director assures him that he is, and asks how he's been in return. With that, he's introduced to the president's grandson. Our protagonist, Muyak, bows his head, waving and introducing himself formally. The great boss extends his hand to our hero, introducing himself as Kim Hazik. He says it's a genuine pleasure to finally meet him. The boss comments that he knew our protagonist had gotten into Korea University and reveals he himself is an alumnus of the same school. Maintaining appearances, the protagonist says he's eager to work alongside such a respected man. This man, a private lender, who graduated from Korea University, gave up his prestigious university diploma just to forge his own path in this cutthroat field. Continuing on, the protagonist sits down and immediately asks for the ledger. Still confident, the great man asks if he's already getting started, telling him to take it easy. He then encourages him to have some tea. Our protagonist, unfazed, says he's not quite used to that, so it might take a moment. He'd prefer to start with the ledger first. After that, he hands over the ledger and thanks him. The protagonist begins to read attentively, once again taking all the time in the world. The boss offers our protagonist a cup of coffee to sip on as he settles in to analyze. He confidently states there won't be any mistakes. After all, he's a graduate in business administration. Our hero feels a bit shaken, reflecting that the ledger seems meticulously organized. But something's off. The Kim Haoshik he knew wasn't meticulous at all. With that thought, the protagonist declares, "This ledger is impeccably organized." Before asking for the bank statements, Kim Haushik discreetly signals one of his servants, without a word. After a short while, our protagonist has already analyzed the bank statements, laid out on the table. His verdict? Only 12 of them were correct. The boss quickly replies, "Those statements are the most crucial, since we can't afford to lose a single one." The protagonist continues, thanking Kim Haushik for all the effort he put in, then states he'll be taking all of this with him. But upon hearing this, the great man is enraged. The protagonist continues, adding that the president instructed him to recover all the bank books managed by him. But Kim Haushik just can't believe the president would order such a thing. Now Kim Haushik is sweating bullets, reflecting that the president was indeed tampering with the bank books himself. The boss then questions, saying he can't just recover them suddenly, and demands if this is truly an order from the president. With a more serious tone, our hero says he has no reason to lie. If he has doubts, he can call Pyong Changdong right. Then, our protagonist continues, asking if there's any reason at all why the bank books can't be recovered. If there is, he should say so at this very moment. Now, looking a bit awkward, Haushik says there's no problem at all. He was just surprised it was so sudden. Thus, our hero says he needs to speak with Haushik. Privately, Kim's men approach, stern-faced, trying to intimidate our protagonist. Suddenly, Director Airos, commanding everyone to follow the protagonist's orders. The grim-faced men stay silent, refusing to leave, though a hint of apprehension creeps in. The protagonist and the director simply observe the tense scene play out. But then Kim Haushik abruptly stands, brutally slapping one of his own men. He warns them, "Don't you dare act like that," in front of the young master. They clearly didn't understand simple words. And now, furious, he orders them out of sight as quickly as possible. Everyone is now out of the room, waiting for the conversation to finally finish. A bit calmer, the boss laments the utter ignorance of those senseless thugs, asking the protagonist for understanding. At that moment, lighting a cigarette, he asks why the protagonist looks so serious for a private chat. Then, Muyak stands up with an intimidating glare, declaring that since Kim Haushik is a mere servant, he should act like one. Now, completely in control of the situation, the protagonist states that Kim Haushik doesn't know how to read the room at all, and is so incredibly stupid, he can't even tell the difference between dung and soybean paste. Kim Haushik, unable to believe his ears, is utterly perplexed. He stands up, furious, shouting that the protagonist is a little bastard, who is absolutely nobody in life. But the protagonist, raising his voice once again, shouts for Kim Haushik to sit down. Outside the room, the men hear the shouting, anxious to know what's going on inside. Moments earlier, while the protagonist was in the car with the director, he was asking for a favor. Director Hay asks him to explain what he means. So, the hero reveals that when he's alone with Kim Haushik in the room, no matter what the director hears, he's not to enter. Still rational, the long-haired director says he isn't sure the protagonist will be okay, as Kim Haushik is not an easy man. In response, the protagonist states that if he can't handle people like Kim Haushik, he won't be able to face the true presidents. Following the commands of future corporations, from outside the room, the president overheard everything, but chose not to intervene. The protagonist now warned Haushik to stop playing tough, insisting he already knew. Haushik was falsifying the bank ledgers. However, he understood he did it just to make a living, so, to some extent, he could turn a blind eye. The man's expression was etched with pure despair, as he was now consumed by anxiety. Enraged, the protagonist then declared that he couldn't possibly be messing with the president's secret account. Outraged, the hero then demanded to know why that lowlife hadn't handed over the private account book. The boss was already breaking into a cold sweat, wondering how anyone else knew about the secret account, since only he and the president were supposed to know. And with that, the protagonist was convinced he had Kim Haushik dead to rights. Kim Haushik remained visibly anxious, under the protagonist's piercing gaze, who fiercely demanded his grandfather's secret notebooks. The protagonist was absolutely certain that he was managing those notebooks and refused to back down, relentlessly demanding them. They were entrusted to the four main bosses of Manhwa, ledgers containing secret accounts, created under names that didn't even exist. Each held 1 trillion won, for a grand total of 4 trillion, a discovery the protagonist made while searching for his grandfather's hidden fortune after his grandfather's death. However, when the real name financial system was implemented, that 4 trillion won had already vanished. And now, Kim Hashik was casually using that money for his own expenses. The hero then challenged the boss, asking why he looked so shocked and clearly assuming he believed this matter was still a secret. Utterly distressed, Hashik realized only he and the president were aware of these ledgers and wondered if the president had tipped off the protagonist. With renewed urgency, Muyuk sternly told the man to bring what he demanded, and to do it fast, given the situation. The boss then begged for a bit more time, stumbling over his words. But the hero stayed utterly serious and declared this wasn't something that needed time. Utterly confident in his actions, the protagonist settled into his chair. He stated that if it wasn't brought in 10 minutes, he'd have no choice but to report everything to the president. Still reeling in shock, Kim pleaded with Miek to wait at least a month, begging for it as a personal favor. Hearing that a favor was being offered, Miek paused to reflect on that. Then he calmly replied that wasn't how you asked for a favor. At that very moment, Kim Hazik's face twisted in utter despair. In response, he sprang from his chair and desperately begged Miek to wait a month. To further convince him, he bowed deeply before the protagonist, practically groveling for more time. Miek, now resolute, told him that he had 2 weeks to prepare everything, and not a single penny better be missing. Then, with an air of absolute superiority, he asked if the boss understood. Kim, being looked down upon, felt a wave of relief. In response, the hero stated that they should keep the day's matter strictly between them, and that Hazik should be very careful not to let any other bosses know about it. Once again, the protagonist asked if he understood, and with a trembling voice, Kim replied that he did. Now adopting a friendlier tone, Miek said he had no problem with the book, Razel, or the bank statements. As he left the room, the protagonist said he'd return to follow up on what was missing in 2 weeks. Outside, he came face to face with 3 men waiting. These were the same goons, the boss's personal thugs, and they certainly weren't in a good mood. But upon seeing this scene unfold, Director Hay shouts for them to clear the way. The toughs, who were trying to intimidate Miek, visibly trembled in fear at the shout. Thus, the two continued their walk out of the building. Quickly, the 3 goofballs rushed back into the room to check on their boss. He was utterly consumed by fear. He couldn't help but wonder if that boy was truly ordinary, because he was completely different from what they described. Another day passed by. Meanwhile, at the formidable loan shark's mansion, the old man was asking how the meeting had gone. Director Hare reported, "Our protagonist received the book Rizal and all 12 bank statements with fake names. He would also be getting reports to be submitted every 2 weeks." The old man asked if there were any other issues with Muyak and Hashik. However, the long-haired man revealed that, at first, Kim treated our protagonist like a subordinate. He added that after their conversation, the young master left the room incredibly confident. These reports made the formidable loan shark pause in thought. With that, he asked who was next on the list, and Mr. Hayes said they were planning to visit No Itchin. The old man thanked the director for his diligence and told him to take a break. He complied, and with that, the president picked up his phone to make a call. He dialed Kim Hashik's number and started by asking how things went and how the protagonist was doing. But Hashik hesitated, taking a moment to respond. Impatient, the old man asked again, demanding to know the reason for the silence. Kim's report revealed that, unlike Presidents Sumin and Suin, our protagonist strongly resembled him. The formidable Chien asked to confirm if that was truly his honest opinion. Following that, The president pressed for details about their private discussion. And once more, Kim Hashik fell silent, visibly stressed. The old man stated he disliked asking twice, and demanded again what they had talked about. Finally, Kim opened his mouth to reveal Muyak had mentioned the secret bank accounts that were entrusted to him. The president was utterly startled by this revelation, his eyes widening in disbelief. He pondered how Muyak had possibly uncovered that. After a prolonged silence, the old man quietly asked if there was anything else. Hashik then reported that he'd agreed to deliver them in 2 weeks, and then wondered if he should actually do it. The president assented, instructing him to deliver them. But there was a catch, the president informed Hashik, who, cowering in his office, anxiously awaited the old man's response. He was now enduring a fierce lecture from the president for daring to raise his voice at his grandson. The scoundrel profusely apologized and promised it would absolutely never happen again. The formidable Chien made it crystal clear that he was merely a servant who simply struck it rich, and that it certainly didn't mean he could ever sit at the same table as the boss. Now considerably calmer, the white-bearded man sternly reminded him not to forget who truly helped him reach his current position. Sweating profusely, Hashik affirmed he would bear that in mind. Afterward, the president silently hung up the phone, and he pondered how the protagonist managed to uncover the secret notebooks he had entrusted to the Mindong heads. He also couldn't comprehend why he insisted they be delivered. He continued, realizing neither Su-man nor Su-han had any knowledge of the accounts. Furthermore, he pondered how Muyak had managed to convince them to hand them over. The old man recalled Kim's words, remarking that the protagonist strongly resembled him. And with that piece of information, he felt utterly pleased. Another night passed at the Grand Loan Shark's opulent mansion. The protagonist mused he now knew Kim, Hashik's weakness, and he wondered if the other Mindong heads had also tampered with that very same bank notebook. He was gravely concerned about the 400 billion won in the orange account set to vanish, following the implementation of the real name financial transaction system. Still restless, the protagonist desired to get his hands on that money, without a soul ever finding out, as it would provide a powerful support for his ongoing battle against the Chien brothers. But soon, he concluded there was no way to get his hands on that money before the real name system was officially announced. The very next day, he found himself in one of the boss's offices. All the checking accounts and other crucial documents were spread across the table. After a thorough review, our hero declared everything was in order and that he'd be checking these accounts every 2 weeks and would also be holding onto the bank books. With a piercing gaze, he asked Insak, one of the big bosses, if he agreed. Insak, one of the big bosses, promptly agreed with the young master. Without a moment's hesitation, the protagonist then pressed, asking if that gentleman possessed any other bank book that rightfully belonged to the president. The boss attempted to feign ignorance about the president's secret notebook. Observing Insak's telling reaction, the protagonist instantly realized that Kim Hashik hadn't breathed a single word to the man. Undeterred, our hero once more inquired if the boss truly held a notebook the president had secretly entrusted to him, justifying that he had personally requested him to take it. Still sweating bullets, the boss stammered that only he and the president were aware of its existence, so he'd absolutely have to confirm with him first. The protagonist, trying to sweeten the deal, assured him that he could indeed be trusted, and that his mere knowledge of a notebook signified the president's true intentions. Judging by the startled reactions of the two bosses, Miek mused that the money hadn't vanished after all. When a new system was put into place, he wondered if they were secretly stashing it away. The protagonist reflected, a cold glint in his eyes, that all of these bosses had established enormous lending companies in Mindong, all thanks to his grandfather, and yet they had shamelessly betrayed him. At that critical moment, Miek sharply asked the man if he needed more time. Still visibly shaking, the boss promised to deliver it within 2 weeks, but quickly reduced that time frame to just 1 week. Upon hearing this surprising concession, our hero felt a wave of relief wash over him, letting out a subtle sigh. feeling quite full of himself. The protagonist declared he would wait for a week and promised not to report anything at all to his grandfather. He knew his grandpa had gone above and beyond for these guys, but still, tampering with the bank book? That was a bridge too far. The protagonist, with a mocking tone, declared that his grandfather was still in peak health and warned that man to tread carefully. He argued that when a dog bites its owner, you simply cannot let that slide. Later that day, our protagonist paid a visit to another boss. He meticulously reviewed the banknotes, but with a lingering suspicion. The man he was visiting this time? Shin Sungul, a formidable wrestling champion, whom his grandfather had supported since childhood, which is why he stood out as the boss, most fiercely loyal to the old loan shark. With this, our protagonist had already finished scrutinizing all the bank books and ledgers completely. Continuing his meticulous inspection, the hero requested the president's secret bank book be handed over, much to Miyuki's surprise. The wrestler didn't hesitate for a second, swiftly moving to retrieve the president's records. He began by approaching a portrait of the president, and upon shifting the portrait, a hidden wall safe was revealed. The towering wrestler handed over the secret notebook without a moment's hesitation and with genuine kindness. This prompted the protagonist to reflect that Shin Sungul hadn't embezzled a single cent, just as was expected of him. There was clearly a good reason his grandfather trusted him. Outside the building, farewells were already being exchanged. In front of his vehicle, the giant declared he eagerly anticipated their next meetings and respectfully bowed to the young master. The protagonist replied that next time, they would meet somewhere far more comfortable. With that, they sped away down the road. The final boss they needed to see was the gentleman and the giant, the one among the four bosses with the most experience. This particular boss, unlike the others, who had learned from the protagonist's grandfather and gone independent, was himself a seasoned loan shark who once competed directly with the legendary Chien in the brutal lending market of the 1970s. And so, the director then asked if the hero knew the nickname of Mr. Yu Qigong. Our protagonist was already well aware of the situation, stating he obviously knew the deal. This was the man who single-handedly crushed the gangsters, who tried to dominate Myeongdong's lending market. He was famously known as Hammer President Yu Jigong. Now, within the confines of his office, he remained completely focused on his work, a serious look etched on his face. After finally noticing the two men in his office, he simply tells them to wait a minute, and then offers them a seat, instructing them to wait just a bit longer. The director was clearly displeased by his attitude, deeming it disrespectful and ready for a confrontation. But our protagonist remains utterly calm and deftly cuts off the long-haired man before he can even make a move. Our hero calmly takes a seat to wait, while the last boss doesn't once lift his eyes from his paperwork. Then moments turned into minutes, and the hours they spent in that office stretched on, seemingly forever. Finally, Jigong rises from his chair, a move that instantly makes our protagonist and the director feel a surge of anxiety. He approaches the two men, apologizing for making them wait such a long time. He explains that the ledger, which he needed to report to the president, required him to meticulously clean it up first, which is why it took a little while. Now, with a thinly veiled mocking tone, he asks if the young master isn't upset. In short, our protagonist merely states that he'd like to take a look at the documents. Adopting an even more offensive tone, Jigong then says Director Hoi must have been working tirelessly lately. He continues, adding that changing diapers while caring for a child must be quite complicated. But our protagonist shows absolutely no reaction. Relentlessly, the boss remarks that the president was being far too harsh on him, as he wasn't really suited for that kind of job, so it must be incredibly difficult for him. Growing even bolder, he suggests that if he couldn't train the protagonist, he should just send him over whenever he wanted, as he would train him from A to Z. Even so, he stood firm. The director, however, warned Jigen to watch his words, given that this was the president's grandson. But this man, unwavering, couldn't understand why he should be cautious around a mere child, as simply calling him young master should suffice. attempting to provoke them. He claimed that outdated displays like these were better suited for loyal subordinates, like the director here, thus warning him not to impose such antics on him, as he'd been in this business for years. Aiming a direct insult at the protagonist, he sneered, asking if he even knew what he was looking at in his hands, and demanded why he didn't just pass it to the director. To stop wasting time, the hero reflected that this method of provocation was incredibly childish, but he simply replied that he was almost done. There was nothing wrong with the accounting books, which was already suspicious enough on its own. But in any case, that didn't matter now. The protagonist argued that there was nothing amiss with the ledger, and at that moment, he demanded the secret notebook be handed over. But the boss didn't understand why he should. The protagonist explained that the president had asked him to retrieve it, and once again proving his utter rudeness, Jigen blew a cloud of cigarette smoke directly into the protagonist's face. Then he scoffed that the president should come here personally. He argued that this was the proper protocol, as he'd personally entrusted it to him, so he shouldn't return it, unless it was done in person as well. After that, he asked if the protagonist disagreed with his argument. A tense atmosphere settled heavily in the room that housed those men. The director, already furious, declared that President Yu was taking his jokes too far, but he retorted that he'd never joke when it came to work and was merely teaching the young master. He lectured him that in business, formality must be precise, and dared to ask if the director hadn't taught the protagonist better manners. Then, even more provocatively, the terrified man inquired if the director hadn't been taking things a little too casually recently. The director absolutely despised hearing that and was moments away from hurting someone. But the protagonist quickly diffused the tension, asking him to step outside for a moment. The protagonist, ever confident, told him to go get some fresh air. He complied, simply saying, "All right." Now, only the protagonist and the nervous man remained in the utterly silent room. Media, already fed up with the delays, demanded he hand over the secret bank book. The scarred, long-haired man's reaction was one of pure shock, exclaiming he couldn't believe they'd told him that. He then stated that the president planned to trust him deeply, yet he couldn't care less about that. He continued, demanding the president himself come personally for the handover. But to everyone's utter shock, Muyak screamed with all his might the president's name, Yu Qigong. The very man who despised being yelled at immediately demanded how he dared to do such a thing. At that moment, the president absolutely snapped, declaring that since before the protagonist was even born, he had been the one protecting the president, walking through Myeongdong and cleaning up his messes. And a mere kid like that couldn't even lift his head to respond to him. He continued fiercely, stating that the only person who could give him orders was the president himself. None of the president's children could command him. Still seething with fury, he declared that merely because the protagonist shared blood with the president didn't mean he was on the same level. Faced with this situation, the protagonist stood up, shouting the president's name once again. And the president's reaction? He instantly placed his hands on his hammer. He proclaimed he had saved the president countless times with that very hammer, even when thugs invaded his office. Their heads caved in by that very hammer. That weapon was the living history of Myeongdong, the brutal proof of the loan shark market. A clear warning to Mayak not to cross him. Our protagonist finally understood that the president was ready to push this to the very end. Still ridiculing Mayak, the president taunted that he wouldn't even begin to understand how this whole business would ultimately end, and remained completely clueless about that world. Our protagonist pondered that the president was clearly trying to assert dominance, but was still going wildly overboard, and questioned the source of such brazen confidence. Muyak was certain that Yuji Gang was in no position to rebel against his grandfather. A new doubt now gnawed at the protagonist's mind, that there was something crucial he didn't know. And this kept hammering relentlessly in his head, like a persistent, gnawing uncertainty. Our protagonist declares that he would give the president just one day to prepare all the necessary bank statements, And if things continued in this manner, he absolutely wouldn't let it slide. And so he walks toward the door, ready to leave the room. But just as he was about to step out, he hears the president call out to him. And there he was, right behind him, about to strike him on the head with that hammer. Our protagonist has no reaction and simply braces for the worst. But just as the blow was about to connect, President Yu had stopped, just short of hitting him. Now, a look of utter surprise spread across his face, but the hammer still hovered ominously at our hero. Flustered, he claimed that in the protagonist's blood, a touch of the president's own courage still lingered, and he remarked that he thought the protagonist would surely wed himself. Now, aiming to truly insult the president, Muyak asks why he was swinging that hammer at all, if he didn't even have the guts to actually hit someone in front of him. He continues, asserting that the moment he attacked, he would also surely die, and asks if he truly thought that bluff would scare him. Still relentless and brimming with confidence, our protagonist tells Yuji Gang to have all the notebooks ready by tomorrow, if he wanted to live, and as he storms out the door, our hero warns that if he dares try that again, he'd better be prepared to get his head crushed. President Yu is absolutely livid. His nerves are completely frayed, but he bites his tongue. A bit later, cooped up inside the car, our protagonist and the director are heading back from their trip. The long-haired man asks what exactly went down, sensing there was quite a commotion earlier. The protagonist, unervingly calm as ever, casually replies that it was nothing serious, just President Yu attempting to smash his head in with a hammer. The car suddenly slams on its brakes in the middle of the road. The director can't process these words, utterly bewildered by what just happened. He asks if our protagonist is all right. A massive line of cars is already forming behind them, creating a colossal traffic jam. The protagonist simply responds that they're smack dab in the middle of the road, blocking everyone else right now. Just then, they've arrived at the opulent mansion of the lone Shark King. The old man immediately demands the reports from the last meeting with Yuji Gang. The director reports that he insisted President Yu come personally to collect the bank notebooks. The white-haired man senses there's more to that conversation and asks for the full story. Hana then informs him that they also tried to hit the young master on the head with a hammer. However, he quickly adds that our protagonist is fine. The old man wonders why Jigong would act that way. The director also can't fathom the reason, as ever since arriving in Mindong, he's competed with the great lone shark, but he's never acted like this before. It seems incredibly strange today. The long-haired man speculates that it's almost as if he's intentionally trying to provoke them. Chien states that Director Ha can handle this matter personally, so he should decide how to deal with it and ensure there are no problems. Given this, the long-haired man says he understands and would give it his all. The furious president, scowling, was on a call in his car, claiming it was no big deal. He added the protagonist was just a kid, only trying to give him a little scare. Jigong countered he wasn't as impressive as he thought, and the president's judgment seemed to be slipping. Or so he thought, but suddenly, a speeding, out of control truck careened toward the back of his car. And then the unthinkable happened. The president was suddenly in a horrific accident. Sometime later, after the incident, deep within an underground room, Jigong was tied up and gagged, completely bewildered. Looming before him stood the imposing shadow of a man radiating a murderous aura. And this towering figure revealed himself to be Director Ha. President Yu now visibly trembled with fear, unable to utter a single word. Then he realized the director clutched a menacing hammer in his hand, sending him into an even deeper panic. Swinging the hammer, the large man calmly stated, "They should have a little chat." The president struggled frantically against his bonds, kicking his feet in desperation. The director pointed the hammer at the president, without a word, intending to intimidate him. Calmly, he removed the cloth covering Yu's mouth. Immediately, the president began screaming that the director would never get away with this. But unfazed, the large man simply asked if he had attempted to hurt the young master with that very hammer. Then, in chilling silence, he slowly raised the hammer and brought it down toward the scoundrel's face. But just before impact, the director stopped. The intimidating hammer hovered, barely an inch away from his head. The director relentlessly pressed him. Why on earth did you do that? Now President Yu, frantic, vented. He was merely testing the protagonist to see if he was worthy of that job, and that he would never actually hit him. He continued to argue desperately that he would never lay a hand on the president's grandson, and pleaded with him to believe his words. Just then, he promised a hand over all the bank books. Suddenly, petrified with fear, a loud crash of metal objects hitting the ground echoed, and then 2 of the director's men appeared carrying a metal canister, his face still grim. The intimidating director asked, "Who sent you?" Terrified, the scoundrel stammered. He had no idea what he was talking about, merely insisting he was testing the hero. Without a word, the suited director signaled for his servants to proceed. The 2 placed the table in front of the president, still tied up, and began to untie his hands. But he still didn't understand what was happening. Becoming even more desperate, one of the servants forced his hand onto the table. The other was also trying to do the same, but the president was still reluctant to comply. The director, maintaining his cold composure, said it was better that the answers given now were more satisfactory, and once again he demanded who sent him. Still terrified, the long-haired man insisted that no one had sent him to do anything, and that no such person existed. And in the blink of an eye, the director lunged toward the table. He slammed the hammer down on one of the president's finger joints, who screamed in agony, his finger bleeding. Once again, the director questioned who had sent him, and he continued with the same answer, struggling to speak due to the pain. And without wasting time, the director struck another one of his fingers, making him beg for help from so much pain. Again, the same question was asked, about who had asked him to do that. Still conscious, the long-haired president said that the director was a lunatic, and that there was no one. And these answers did not please the director, who struck him once more after that. Repeatedly, he hit his fingers over and over again. After some time enduring this suffering, the table was already drenched in blood. The director asked one final time, "President Yu Qigong." The director offered him a piece of advice. Keep the fingers of his right hand intact. He pressed again, demanding to know who gave the orders. But the president remained stubbornly silent, offering no answer. He just looked down mercilessly. The suited director demanded he be seized. But with that very threat, the long-haired scoundrel decided to spill the beans, claiming he'd reveal everything if they stopped. He revealed he was ordered by Chien Suman. President Chien Suman had commanded him to do all that. A week earlier, in a grand, luxurious house, the 4 presidents were gathered in a private business room, and a very important person was arriving at that location with many men bowing before him. Upon his arrival there, he greeted everyone, stating it had been a long time. The 4 presidents greeted Shirin Suman, bowing to him now. Everyone was gathered in the room, ready for the conversation to begin. The fearful president asked why they had been summoned there, wanting to know the reason. The 4 of them were gathered together. Thus, Shin Suman mentioned that everyone had heard about the new boy at his father's house. A fighter asked if he meant the president's grandson, the son of the late Mrs. Sak. Shun began to spill the beans, saying that he was learning to work with his grandfather and the director these days. One of the presidents reported that the young man had appeared suddenly and claimed he would learn the old man's work by sticking to him, but they were afraid this would spread strange rumors. Suman stated that they were all like family members and the very foundations of Minden. Continued the president's work, but there were whispers of another air. A heavy silence fell over the room, with all the presidents already knowing what was about to come. Suman said he wasn't sure how much longer his father would be around, so they needed to address this situation immediately to stop any low-life outsider from swooping in and clouding the chairman's judgment. The fiery president warned Suman to mind his language, since the revered loan shark was still in top form. The notorious cracked-mouthed scoundrel replied He admitted to speaking out of turn in front of the big boss, and that his loyal followers were truly devoted, but insisted for the chairman's well-being, they should definitely eliminate anyone who might tamper with his decisions. Once again, an uneasy silence fell over the room, following Suman's provocative statements. One pointed out that, as the chairman's grandson, this was strictly a family affair, so they had no right to meddle. But Suman retorted, claiming it wasn't just a family spat, and scoffed at the idea of fearing that young man. Instead, he revealed his true concern was his father's final decision. The man with the scarred lips added, they couldn't predict how the political landscape would shift, with the new chairman taking power, so that single decision could drastically impact their business. They exchanged silent glances for a tense moment. Then, Simon announced that very soon, Director Hay would visit the mall accompanied by the young master. The formidable figure then stated, they weren't asking for anything outlandish. They merely wanted to test the young man's mettle. Silence once again enveloped them all as they pondered their next move. However, the first to pound his glass on the table in agreement was Chairman Yu. He was dead set on testing him just once to see if he was truly worth their time. He scoffed that the so-called hero was just a mere 20-year-old who knew absolutely nothing about their operations. And now, he vowed to teach the protagonist a harsh lesson. Suman practically glowed with delight, declaring that, as always, Chairman Yu was the fastest to grasp the situation. He urged the other chairman to consider carefully, since his father's time was rapidly running out. They all watched intently, curious and utterly astonished by what they'd just heard. And so at last, Suman left his dear nephew in their care. The president was already well aware that Suman was pulling all the strings. The director reported that they'd tried to test the young master, and among them, President Jigong stepped forward, proclaiming he would handle it. The president then asked what had become of Jigong, and a man in black revealed he was rushed to the hospital for surgery and could no longer use his left hand. However, the president declared that man had toiled by his side for 30 years and ordered them to let him live so he could retire. The director then inquired what the gentleman would do with the two presidents, and if that warning would be sufficient. Grumpily, the old man declared he'd handle him alone. Meanwhile, the malicious president was absolutely outraged by Jigong's fate. The fearful president reported that his hands had been crushed by a hammer, and now they truly feared that their father had uncovered everything. Suddenly, the phone beside them began to ring. The evil president answered, furiously apologizing, and on the other end of the line, they stated the decision rested with the higher president. The old man already knew Suman was by his side, and the man with slicked back hair confirmed it. The ruthless loan shark asked if he'd order the Mindong bosses to test Magek, and Suwon stumbled over his words, claiming he'd only ordered them to take care of him. However, the president, upon hearing this, remained ominously silent. Furious, the old man snapped. He should have matured at least a little by that age. The white-haired man questioned whether he'd truly done all that, because he felt threatened by a mere boy who had just turned 20 years old. And now he declared that with Sawon's actions, he seriously questioned whether he should truly make Mook his heir. Still utterly frustrated, the man with slick back hair tried to apologize, but the president refused to hear any of it. The imposing loan shark declared he didn't want to hear a single word about him messing with his grandson again, and if that happened, he'd kick him out of the family penniless. Hearing this, the president recoiled, wondering if his father would truly go through with it. The other person next to him was curious to know what his father had said, but the call abruptly ended, and Suin furiously slammed the phone against the wall and raged at the protagonist for coming between him and his father. Meanwhile, at the old man's estate, a new crisis was brewing. It was reported that the newly elected president, Kim Man-san, was reorganizing the House Council. The director reported he would overhaul the army as soon as he took office and was firing all council members. The man in black continued, stating, this was the members' reaction to not meeting more frequently these days. The old man mused that perhaps The president was planning to abolish the council, even before officially taking office. Thus, he was determined to act. After all, he had faced many losses during the military regime, having possibly joined forces to overthrow the regime, but they wouldn't get far in the future. The old man wondered if the military would simply allow that, as that country was essentially theirs. However, the director countered, some are worried about the possibility of a coup. At that moment, the formidable loan shark reflected on whether a coup was truly possible and questioned what Muyak thought about it. The one quietly reading a newspaper, on the other side of the couch, argued that the military would not resist at all. He continued, explaining that the president had already replaced the cabinet and the security commander, who were the very core of the military, taking only 4 hours for the reorganization. Thus, even if he dealt with the ruling forces, they were considered a conservative regime, and besides the council, there were no other military officers willing to conform. The protagonist declared that the most crucial thing was this: the people wouldn't tolerate the military promoting a coup d'etat, or forming a new regime. Upon hearing this, the old man beamed with delight. Seeing that Muyak was also interested in politics, the hero then stated that this was the biggest variable in his work, since he made sure to stay updated on even the smallest pieces of news. He knew, even though, exactly what would happen in the next 30 years. Now, the president asked if there were any other issues, besides the council, and what other plans the elected president was promoting. The director reported that, apparently, nobody knew what he was thinking, not even the secretaries. They had planted within the administration, knew what the VIP was planning. Continuing on, the man in black reported that it was said, at the main conference, the topic would be a war against corruption. Thus, they would recommend disclosing the assets of high-ranking officials, despite facing great opposition, considering the president's personality. Now, the great loan shark said he'd already expected that, but still, it was a very sudden and major change, and he questioned the real name financial system. The bearded director reported that this wasn't mentioned at all. Economic matters and large corporations had failed to obtain any information on it. That said, the old man asked for the director's opinion. Mr. Hare reported that the expected reaction was that the side effects of a real name financial system would occur, at best, within a year, making it only possible to implement at the very end of the president's term. Thus, from the extinction of the last council to the disclosure of high-ranking officials' assets, the president would have already taken remedial action. Implementing this financial system would only place an unnecessary burden on him. Confronted with this, the president sought the protagonist's opinion. With unwavering conviction, he declared that the real name financial system would still be implemented that very year, no matter the cost. Feeling uneasy, the president inquired about his justification. This had been debated since the 1970s, but political protests always ended in failure. Given the president's personality, he planned to finalize preparations and announce it as a surprise. At that moment, the president burst out laughing, saying the protagonist was smart, but unaware of how politicians truly thought, since their destiny was to never escape the entanglement of political funds. Thus, the moment he implemented this system, all his hidden funds would be exposed, and he'd have no way to manage it, never able to quickly dispose of the evidence. Miek agreed with that, but believed they needed to prepare for funds held under third-party names and anonymous accounts. Now, the president was aware that the hero truly cared about the real name system and urged him not to worry. He explained he had divided and entrusted them to people he could trust. With a serious demeanor, Miek then told his grandfather that human greed knew no bounds. He explained that with the seals and checkbooks, borrowed names wouldn't be an issue. But once the system was implemented, the president wouldn't be able to access the money, creating a massive problem. The truth was, because of the real name financial system, grandfather had lost almost a quarter of his wealth, held in borrowed and anonymous accounts. The protagonist knew the real name system would be implemented in August, and that without caution, The president could lose enormous sums of money. The old president remained thoughtful about everything that had been discussed. Then, with a serious expression, the great loan shark questioned if the protagonist truly thought this system would be implemented that very year and wondered if that was just a guess. Muyak affirmed, saying it was what his intuition told him. He mentioned it could be delayed until the start of the president's term, but no later than that summer. Suddenly now, the president asked if the hero had also discovered the bank books given to the Mindong chiefs through his intuition. However, he reported that he'd never told anyone about those books and demanded how the protagonist had found out about them. But what he didn't expect was that the protagonist was waiting for him to ask that very question. So he revealed that upon taking over the bank books, judging by the expressions on their faces, everyone felt something was off. He continued saying that in a private space, when he asked them directly, it was clear they were hiding something, and they themselves confirmed it. With that, the big idiot asked if all this was just his intuition, and Muyak confirmed it was. Right then, the old man called Muyak to tell him something serious. The president entrusted the protagonist with 400 billion from the secret accounts and asked him to protect and use the money as he saw fit. The old man said that if the protagonist wasted this money, it would be the last he'd ever receive. Then he asked if he understood completely. Lowering his head, the hero promised he wouldn't make any mistakes. Convinced, the protagonist reflected that he'd expected all of this, but was surprised because he hadn't expected her and hastened to trust him with everything. With 400 billion Mindong in hand at that moment, he realized he could supercharge his plan to fight against the Chien brothers in the future. Thus, he exclaimed, proving his grandfather's trust was well placed. Time flowed by at the mansion. Muyak, however, was nowhere to be found. The old man ordered the director to consolidate all accounts, those acquired under false names, and have them ready by July. The shadowy director of the underground world replied he would execute the president's command. The white-haired man then pondered Muyak's words. The real name system would be implemented by August if this truly came to pass. Muyak, a child born with an innate intuition for celestial fortune, would surely reveal himself. In February 1993, the presidential inauguration ceremony commenced. As a civilian leader, not a military one, his appointment heralded the start of the so-called civil government. Immediately upon taking office, the president launched reforms, dissolving the council, disclosing public officials' assets, and preparing for the real name system's rollout. Meanwhile, at the university, during Korea University's admission ceremony, Muyak stood on stage, receiving an award from one of the university's key figures. Everyone applauded our protagonist's achievement. After all the fanfare, he was already outside with his friend, Myung-soo, who found the whole thing excruciatingly boring. Myung-soo asked what our hero planned to do now. That classes were starting tomorrow. Muyak replied he'd check out the library, which struck his friend as odd, calling him weird for studying on day one. On the other hand, our protagonist argued that since they were in college, they should at least know their way around the library. But still, Myung-soo eyed our protagonist with a hint of disdain. A surprised Myung-soo noted that our hero's accent was already incredibly natural, especially since he'd only arrived in Seoul recently. He then asked if he was trying to charm a girl. Myung-soo's plan was to visit one of the wealthiest districts nearby, to drink and celebrate their admission. However, our protagonist wasn't in the mood to drink at all. Myung-soo admitted he'd made a mistake the last time they drank and promised not to repeat it. And then our protagonist asked if he only cared about having fun instead of prepping for the big exam. Confidently, the shorter guy declared he'd aced the first phase of the exam and just wanted to party that day. With that, he kept pleading with Mu-yu to go out drinking. Now, finally swayed, our protagonist agreed they'd just have a few drinks and head back that night. They were already at an incredibly lively club with loud music blasting. Myung-soo tried to get close to the dancing girls, exclaiming that was the smell of youth. But they looked very uncomfortable around him. He told me this place was a rock cafe, and there were no such spots in Busan. They didn't reserve tables there. Just for fun. The protagonist wasn't in the mood for much conversation, just quietly drinking in his corner. Until suddenly, a girl approached him who recognized him. They commented that they knew he was the top student at Korea University and said they thought he was a total model student who only studied. But look, he also frequented places like this. They continued, revealing they were his seniors at the university in their second year and heard he'd aced the entrance exam. Now, clearly flirting with our protagonist. One of them said he was even more handsome up close and that she couldn't believe the best student in the country had a face like that, asking to join him. A bit disheartened, our hero said he didn't mind if they joined him, but first mentioned he planned to leave after finishing his current drink. Suddenly, Myung-soo interrupted, exclaiming it was all good, and they should just have tons of fun that night. The music kept blaring, and the atmosphere was perfectly pleasant. In that lively environment, they all gathered at the same table and began chatting. The interested girls asked if they'd been friends before, and Myung-soo replied they had been since childhood. One of the girls then noticed Myung-soo, not from Seoul, reveals he's actually from Busan. He then asks if any of them have ever visited and begins talking about the beautiful Gwangali Beach. The noble maiden realizes he's indeed mentioning Gwangali Beach and finds Myung-soo's accent absolutely adorable. Meanwhile, the girl beside our protagonist wonders why he's being so quiet, but then asserts it totally makes sense. Being this handsome, he should be stoic. Just looking at him makes her feel good. Suddenly, a sharp-dressed man in a suit calls out to our hero, surprised to find him here. Mayak recognizes that voice instantly, saying it sounds incredibly familiar. And just like that, he comes face to face with one of the club's powerful presidents. This is Ju-won, whom the girl at their table already knows, and she asks if this guy knows Mayak. Our hero wonders where that guy even popped out from, and decides it's best to avoid him entirely. The protagonist decides to say he's leaving and calls Min-soo to come along. But Min-soo strongly disagrees, saying he'd like to have a few more drinks. Mayak, ever stoic, tells him to just have one more beer and then head home, and exclaims to Ju-won not to mind them, and to just enjoy himself. Before that, he warns him not to overdo it, and certainly not to cause trouble again. The maiden, clearly interested in our protagonist, complains loudly, asking him where he thinks he's going. But as she tries to run after our hero, she's suddenly stopped by Ju-won, who questions why she's even walking with guys like Myung, calling them such low class. But the young lady does not like his attitude at all, saying it doesn't matter who she's with, especially not to him. Mayak was already keeping a close eye on the unfolding situation, and reflected that whenever he drank, he always ended up getting involved in these kinds of messes. The maiden kept demanding that man let her go, but he remained firm. Suddenly, the protagonist decides to act, telling that scoundrel to stop bothering the girl. But he does not like Mayak's attitude at all, telling him to let go, and that he shouldn't dare to touch him. The hero reflects that Ju-won has always been a troublemaker, ever since he was young, but it was always obvious that his antics deeply troubled his grandfather. Now, leaning in close to the scoundrel's ear, he whispers that he doesn't want anyone to see he knows him, because it's utterly shameful. He then points out that there are tons of people around, and he should stop causing such a scene, as his grandfather would have to clean up all his messes. The protagonist's words truly hit Ju-won hard, leaving him anxious but now dangerously determined. Ju-won was hell-bent on finishing Mia off that very day. He calls his crew, and 3 thugs quickly arrive on the scene, boasting they were just having fun when they got his call. Mia had already suspected that the scoundrel definitely had backup. The scoundrel then snarls that a filthy cockroach had crawled into his house, and orders them to stomp the protagonist into the ground, telling them not to worry, as this wasn't their first rodeo. Prepared for a fight, the protagonist tells Myung-soo to get the veterans out of there. Frightened, his friend asks if things will even be okay, but Mayak quickly retorts, asking if he forgot who he was. To Mayak's surprise, however, he was actually referring to the enemies, questioning if they would be okay. Before Mayak could even finish his sentence, Mayak was already under attack, but luckily he expertly dodges and quickly retaliates in the very same moment, with a devastating punch, knocking his opponent down cold. He felt the same rush of joy he'd known in his youth when fighting off bullies. Some time passes, and the music continues to blare at the party. But now, with a chaotic mess everywhere, there was no one left standing, and Juin could no longer hide his utterly terrified expression. After all, his henchmen were all defeated and sprawled across the ground, completely unconscious. Suddenly, Mayak was right in front of him, ready to finish what he started. The protagonist then tells him to stop hanging around with those losers and acting like such a punk. As his grandfather already knows absolutely everything, the hero still couldn't believe that someone like Juin could ever exist. He was the family's eldest son. With this in mind, Muyok warns that if it happens again, it won't matter if he's his cousin. He absolutely won't let it slide. Jivan lowers his head, asserting he understands perfectly. As they leave the place, the protagonist tells him to take care of the rest and make sure no one is bothered by this whole mess. And if it happens again, they'll have to meet again. And once again, the big scoundrel couldn't hide his expression of fear and despair. It was a sunny day with a clear sky. While classes were underway at Hagi University, a professor was teaching his subject, asking the students if any of them knew what Article 1 of the country's constitution stated. Soon a boy raised his hand and answered that the Republic of Korea was a democratic republic. The professor quickly confirmed that the answer was correct, and then asked about Article 1, Section 2. However, none of the students knew how to answer that question. Given this, the old man explained that the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea resided in the people. Thus, all state authority emanates from the people. The professor stated that anyone who became a prosecutor, lawyer, or judge after graduating there should always keep Article 1, Sections 1 and 2 in their hearts. Miyagi, who was present, reflected on what the professor had said about a professional who forgets those two pillars, not truly being a legal professional. Upon leaving the classroom, Yanjin called out to the protagonist, who asked about the plans with Kyung-sung for that night. But he replied that Kyung-sung was also busy with training. Then, suddenly, a voice resonated behind them, calling out for the protagonist, and there stood a beautiful woman, asking if that man was indeed Muyak. Noticing the girl's stunning appearance, Myung-sun was already astonished, exclaiming that she was incredibly beautiful, and questioned who she was. The young lady then introduced herself as Chin Jisoo. She claimed Mayak would know her. The hero realized that, even though he was meeting her for the first time, that look on her face felt eerily familiar. He knew she was his uncle's daughter, Chin Soo-min, and the president's granddaughter. The protagonist stated he distinctly remembered her eyes when she treated him like an insect in his past life. Despite his grim memories, the lady asked if he had some free time, as she needed to talk with him. Mayak fell silent for a moment, pondering how he would respond. Later, inside a car, she apologized for not introducing herself sooner, saying it had been a long time since she visited her grandfather. She then commented that she'd heard the protagonist scored the highest on the entrance exam, graduated as the best in his class, and revealed she also studied business administration there. However, Mayak was not in the mood for pleasantries and quickly asked why she was really there, revealing he had plans to meet a friend. Seeing his chilly reaction, the president's granddaughter commented that the protagonist was a bit cold, considering it was their first meeting, his cousins. The protagonist retorted that his uncles had given him a lot of trouble and a strict upbringing, so when she said she was their daughter, he couldn't help but be wary. The girl was already well aware of the circumstances, knowing that Mayak had dominated all the bosses in Mindong. Thus, she revealed she had come to see him. After suddenly learning about that, she was suddenly proposing an alliance with Mayak, her hand extended. The protagonist still didn't understand her meaning. The woman continued, explaining that there was no need for them to be pitted against each other, as she had no interest in her grandfather's business. And also, She didn't care whether Mayok learned from him or not. Now she revealed that her only interest was in the Samsung group. After this shocking revelation, Muyue finally grasped the true meaning behind her words. With that, the girl revealed that if our protagonist assisted her, she would ensure he became his grandfather's successor. She then continued, explaining that before his arrival, Ju-won was the clear heir. But with Muyue now in the game, everything will be different. The stunning woman observed that lately, it looked like a battle was brewing between the protagonist and his brother. So, if an alliance was forged, she would give him invaluable intel to secure his victory. Muyue, however, scoffed, not believing Ju-won could truly achieve anything. He claimed she was overestimating her brother. Yet, the girl warned him not to underestimate him, as he was the eldest grandson. And no matter how much the protagonist's grandfather liked him, he was still an outsider. In essence, the noble maiden stated that if Ju-won gained the Samsung Group's backing, anything could happen. Our protagonist needed to be careful. Hearing this, our hero questioned what she wanted in return, as alliances always involve a give and take. At that, the brown-haired girl divulged that if the protagonist inherited his grandfather's position, he would need to support her with the Samsung shares he would acquire. But the protagonist didn't grasp it. To him, Ju-won becoming the successor would naturally support her anyway, since she was his blood relative. But upon hearing this, the woman let out a harsh laugh, filled with irony. She argued that if that guy took control of the business, he'd likely try to devour the entire Samsung empire. Given his immense ambition, still suspicious, Muyue questioned if she could really take over the Samsung Group, even with his support, as the conglomerate already had a clear succession plan. However, the maiden clarified that she didn't aim to seize the entire Samsung Group. She wasn't reckless. She simply wanted to secure at least half. It was her mother's rightful claim. As the eldest daughter of Samsung, our hero recalled that in his previous life, Jisoo dove into the succession war right after the chairman passed away. After a fierce and brutal battle, she managed to secure a third of Samsung, but by then, the group was already beyond repair. So, the woman he knew shouldn't be underestimated, as she'd stab him in the back without a second thought to achieve her goals. With that in mind, the protagonist concluded that it was utterly strange for her to be proposing a deal to him. At this very moment, continuing his line of thought, Miek exclaimed that she'd only lose with this agreement, but she didn't grasp what he was saying. He explained that it seemed she was siding with the underdog, receiving only a promise from him, because if he didn't become his grandfather's successor, she'd gain nothing, and even if he took over, she'd be in deep trouble if he betrayed her. Jisoo reflected, concluding he was right, admitting she was at a disadvantage. But she couldn't stand the thought of her brother taking all the assets for himself. She then added that scoundrel had always gotten everything since he was young, and she'd love to see someone else snatching what he was getting. The protagonist was pleased with her words and said he'd think about it. Anxious, the woman pleaded for an answer as soon as possible. She then revealed that if the protagonist said no, she'd have to find another way to achieve her goals. With that, Miek got out of the car, and the girl drove off. Suddenly, Mungsu was back, looking for our protagonist. He questioned who that slender girl was, and was indignant, complaining that only our hero got all the beautiful women. Miek explained that she was just his cousin, whom he'd met for the very first time. Upon hearing this, his friend couldn't hide the huge smile spreading across his face. He now clung desperately to the idea that Muyak would become his brother-in-law. He was eager to get closer to the woman himself. With this in mind, the protagonist continued to ponder his cousin's strange actions. He vividly recalled that in his past life, she hadn't even treated him like a human being, but now she was proposing an alliance instead, one that was incredibly favorable to him. He now saw this as a golden opportunity, or perhaps a very dangerous, cunning trap. Now, back at the mansion of the great Chief Chien, the old man asked if Muyak had enjoyed his first class. The protagonist explained that his cousin had come to meet him. The old man exclaimed that the hero had no siblings, so he should at least get along with his cousins. To reassure him, the protagonist mentioned he decided to keep in touch with her frequently. But all of this was just part of his grand plan, to seize those coveted Samsung assets. At that moment, the boss inquired why the protagonist had requested to see him as soon as he'd gotten home. In response, Muyak explained it concerned the 400 billion won in the secret account that had been entrusted to him. He then revealed his desire to move everything abroad. He argued that there was no immediate need for it, so he decided to invest the funds overseas. The old man presumed he was feeling confident, but asked if he remembered what was said to him when the account was first handed over. Muyak clearly recalled that the money was the last he'd received from his grandfather. In light of this, the old man remarked, it wasn't a bad idea to keep it within the country, to maintain the current situation as it was. He then asked why Muyak insisted on transferring it abroad. Quickly becoming alert, the hero knew it wasn't easy to move such a large sum out of the country, especially with the new financial system being implemented. But with his grandfather's immense influence, it was still undeniably possible. Thus, the protagonist argued that, in his opinion, the current administration was starting to create unfavorable policies, specifically targeting his grandfather. And even if he wasn't the direct target, he believed the underground economy he had built would suffer even more, so he deemed it essential to cleverly move the money. Miek then stated, it will be simple to send the 400 billion abroad, using the conglomerate's subsidiaries. The old man's view was that it wasn't difficult to transfer the money, but he saw no valid reason for doing so. He then questioned if it was too hasty to move the money, just based on policies that hadn't even been implemented yet. The hero persistently argued that, since the money had been entrusted to him, he earnestly requested his grandfather's support. In the protagonist's mind, that seemed bold, but taking a direct approach might actually be better. After all, he couldn't use all his knowledge to persuade him. But suddenly, the boss began to laugh loudly. He compared Miek to his uncles, who couldn't even speak, without stuttering in front of him. Thus, he didn't know if the protagonist wasn't afraid, or if he was simply full of spirit. With that, he revealed that thanks to the protagonist, he had been laughing a lot in recent days. And now, he agreed to transfer only some funds again. The hero then asked him to transfer the entire amount of 400 billion and pleaded that for the next 7 years he not be questioned about the money at all. The old man was surprised by the protagonist's sheer audacity in using these methods to manage his money. But with confidence, Miek assured him that there was absolutely no chance they would lose the 400 billion. In light of this, the big boss told him to do as he wished and would ask the director to discreetly transfer everything to the United States. However, once again, he warned him that if he lost the money, there would be no second chance. Still confident in his actions, the protagonist said he understood all of this. In his mind, he needed the funds to confront his uncles in the future. Thus, with the money out of the country, they wouldn't interfere at all. However, he knew that managing all this money alone would be a major hassle. So, he needed someone to take charge on his behalf. With that in mind, he remembered Super from Manga, a notorious hunting dog for foreign investment companies. In the late 90s, this man completely rocked the Korean stock market. He was an individual investor during that period who had faced numerous failures and mishaps. He was the one who raked in hundreds of billions, all in just 10 years. Kongdong. Time passed quickly once again, and now, our protagonist found himself at the Moon Sun Motel. Director Hai had informed him that this person had numerous loan debts, so finding him wasn't difficult at all. But first, Hai had asked why our protagonist wanted to find a man like that. Muyak had already entered the motel, looking for the reception desk. Once there, he told the attendant that he was looking for someone named Mr. Han Kun-young. Startled, the lady asked if he was from the police. She explained that no one filled out records in a lodging like this, so she didn't know anyone's name. So, our hero asked if there was a man in his 20s who had been staying there for a long time. In response, the woman tried to recall if there was any young guy staying at the motel. But then suddenly, Muyak offered the lady a considerable sum of money to refresh her memory. Suddenly, she remembered everything, but she still didn't know his name. She confirmed that a young man was indeed staying there and said she would check, but to everyone's surprise, the very man they were talking about appeared, yawning. The lady quickly pointed to him, exclaiming that it was indeed that guy. At that very moment, the young man got scared and dashed for the stairs. Muyak ran after him, calling out his name. He pleaded for him to wait, saying he just wanted to talk. The long chase led them to the building's rooftop. There, the guy was trying to jump off in an act of desperation. Our protagonist begged him not to do it, explaining he wasn't there to collect money. The man began to listen to him, but he was still very much in shock and distressed. Once again, the protagonist urged them to just talk things out. Filled with terror, the great genius questioned if he was a loan shark himself. This question, however, made Mike reevaluate his own situation, since, well, he was also a loan shark. Now, the protagonist and the great genius found themselves standing before the Mi Kyung real estate agency, right in front of a foreboding door. The hero wondered aloud if this was truly the right place. A trembling Han asked if he was absolutely sure about going inside, claiming the people in there were incredibly terrifying. The brave protagonist declared, "We're here to pay these people what we owe them, so there's no reason to be afraid." They swiftly stepped into the room, where they spotted two men in the middle of a meal. These very men were visibly startled by their unexpected appearance. Facing them, they were utterly displeased by Han Kanyong's presence. The chubby guy immediately approached Kanyong, asking if he had simply come there to die. But as soon as this lowlife tried to lay hands on Four Eyes, the protagonist intervened, grabbing his arm mid-air. Without a moment's hesitation, the hero immobilized the man, expertly twisting his arm behind his back. Enraged, the man demanded to know who he was, ordering him to release his arm immediately. The protagonist, still perfectly confident, stated they were there to settle the debt. "So stop making a fuss and call your boss." Just then, the boss himself appeared at the doorway, demanding to know what all the commotion was about. But the moment he spotted Kian Young, he was visibly startled. He then exclaimed, "Four Eyes, you have no idea how much we've missed you and been looking for you all about your money." Muyuk quickly interrupted, declaring he would pay off that young man's debt himself. Then he asked, "How much is the grand total?" The loan shark explained that 6 months prior, he'd borrowed $500 with a 30% upfront interest, plus a monthly rate of 22% and a 12% late fee. But while he was still rambling, the protagonist was already losing his patience. He sharply told him to stop fiddling with that book and just tell them how much he was extorting in total. Upon hearing these blunt words, the scoundrel grinned and said, "Looks like this young man is quite experienced, quick to understand how things work." Turns out, the truth was revealed. He owed a meager 50 million won, and he claimed he wanted to resolve it cleanly. At that staggering figure, Quattro Alhas totally freaked out. He'd been told just days ago he only owed 25 million. He angrily questioned, how could they demand 10 times that amount in a single year? Meanwhile, the greasy scoundrel already had his smug answer, ready and waiting on the tip of his tongue, claiming it was all in the contract, and that the client was utterly shameless for not bothering to read it. He glibly explained there were late fees, plus the 17 million they spent tracking him down. Oh, and don't forget 8 million for emotional damages. Adding it all up, the grand total was 50 million. Miek already understood that in this brutal world, the magic of turning 5 million into 50 was terrifyingly possible. While the young man trembled with furious rage at the blatant fraud, the protagonist reflected that the core of loan sharking was to ruthlessly squeeze desperate people dry. Seeing the debtor's stunned attitude, the unscrupulous loan shark sneered. He shouldn't be so audacious and arrogant, especially since he'd been fleeing from his debt. He deserved to have his flesh torn from his bones and pickled. And while Quattro Alhas was trembling, paralyzed with fear, Miek confirmed that 50 million would solve everything. And the loan shark confirmed that if he brought that money, he would tear up all the documentation right then and there. Next, the protagonist asked to use the phone, and his request was granted. He quickly called Director Han and asked him to prepare 50 million won and bring it to his current address. No sooner said than done. Miek reported that in just 15 minutes, the money would be there, and the loan shark was clearly surprised by how utterly uncomplicated this boy was. But then the greedy scoundrel couldn't help but ask why he was paying such a massive debt for that man, and questioned if he had any relationship with him. To that, the protagonist calmly explained that they had met for the very first time today, but he had business with the man and was therefore paying on his behalf. Yet again, the loan shark was truly impressed by this young man and immediately expressed interest in working with him, even offering him a position right in his office. Miek, however, declined, stating he was still a student. The loan shark insisted, stating that after graduation, Miek absolutely had to call him. He guaranteed a truly exceptional payment. The protagonist reflected, realizing he didn't even remember this particular loan shark. He'd likely vanish completely from the scene once the new real name system was implemented. Cutting to the chase, he flatly stated he wasn't interested in the position, then brazenly asked how much he could earn in that dump. This completely caught the loan shark off guard. That scoundrel's subordinates were clearly infuriated by the hero's brazen words. Miek pressed on, saying that even if he handled loans, the man should still know his limits and shouldn't threaten debtors with hired thugs. The loan shark simply chuckled, replying that he truly enjoyed doing just that. Then he questioned if Miek hadn't learned good manners, considering his extremely aggressive tone. In response, Miek retorted that an unethical loan shark, lecturing about education and good manners, was an absolute joke. This comment sparked immense outrage in the loan shark, who immediately ordered his men to grab the protagonist so he could teach him a little respect. Quattro Alhas, who had been watching everything unfold, was far more terrified than Miek. Miek, on the other hand, couldn't care less about the unfolding situation. Instead, he casually checked his watch, knowing it was time. Suddenly, the doors to the establishment burst open. The hero already knew exactly who was about to walk in. Perfect timing, he murmured. As he entered the room, the director immediately asked if anything was amiss. Two imbeciles working for the loan shark foolishly tried to intimidate the director, demanding to know who he was. Stepping closer, the chubby subordinate snarled, "How dare you invade this place? Do you have a death wish?" he added. The larger thug continued to badger him, asking if he was with those two thugs inside, threatening that he'd get beaten to a pulp right alongside them. But the loan shark boss instantly recognized the director's identity and frantically yelled for his men to stop the whole charade. In an instant, the boss was bowing his head deeply to Ha. He bowed low to him, however. The man with the shaved head asked if he knew him, and the fool replied, "Anyone involved in the Mindong business would recognize me," he stated, "and know I work for President Chien Tai-san." Now, with his tail between his legs, the loan shark timidly asked what brought him to such a humble place. But without a single word to him, the director simply handed the 50 million to the young master. Upon hearing the words that came out of the director's mouth, revealing Muyak was the young master, he completely panicked. The loan shark was utterly terrified, and now realized that the young man was the grandson of President Chien Tai-san, his daughter's son. The director then asked what was happening, and the hero explained that nothing special was occurring. He was just paying the debt of someone he knew. And now, toying with the loan shark, he remarked that the boss here was looking for family education, not money. He collapsed to the ground on his knees, begging for forgiveness from Manhua. He exclaimed that he had made a grave mistake by not recognizing the young master, and pleaded for his life. His men did not understand what was happening, so he quickly ordered them to kneel, for that was President Chien's grandson. Now at that moment, the three fools were kneeling, saying they were very sorry and begging for forgiveness. Master Han, who was observing everything, could not believe what was happening before his eyes. At that moment, without saying a word, Miek simply placed the briefcase of money on the chief's desk. Now, with confidence and mockery, he said that he could take his money. Now, the protagonist ordered the loan shark to check if the money was all there. As he rummaged through it, he realized there was exactly 50 million, and in response, Miek demanded he quickly return the contract. Still trembling, the charlatan grudgingly handed over the envelope. Our protagonist, without a single word of complaint, simply met the four-eyed thug's gaze and thrust the envelope right into his hands, instructing him to check it over. Han's trembling hands were painfully obvious, as he was still completely out of sorts. He stared at the envelope, utterly shocked, without a single word, but then suddenly, he jolted into action. He started furiously tearing up all the paperwork, right there in front of everyone present, leaving nothing left of that now worthless deed. Everyone present watched on in utter disbelief at the wild situation that had just unfolded before them. Miek coolly asked if his debt was finally settled, and the stunned loan shark could only stammer, "Yes, it's all completely paid in full." Now, our hero proposed it was time for his calculations, but the scoundrel didn't understand what he meant. Our protagonist argued that, for the mental shock he'd suffered from their threats and aggressive language, he'd deduct 10 million. He then started taking the money right from the briefcase. The loan shark, terrified until this moment, now utterly failed to understand our hero's attitude. Our protagonist continued, coolly stating he would take another 15 million more for all the trouble he went through to find Han, and another 10 million for disrupting the director with those hefty fees. It was now utterly evident the loan shark was losing complete control of the situation. He demanded to know what that young man was doing. But Miek remained absolutely firm, stating he was just settling debts his way. And for his final calculation, he declared he'd take 15 million as compensation for simply wasting his valuable time, bringing the grand total to 50 million won. And now that his calculations were finished, he coolly asked if he could take that bag with him. The charlatan exploded, claiming the prodag was going too far, and demanded how he could possibly do that to him. However, the protagonist remained utterly confident in his actions, stating he was simply following his own way of doing things, and affirmed that he was not wrong in the slightest. With these arguments laid bare, the loan shark was utterly speechless. All he could do was stammer, completely at a loss for words. Director Hay, brimming with confidence in Miek, didn't interfere in the slightest. He simply watched as it all unfolded. Our hero declared everything resolved and announced his departure. But first, he had one last thing to tell the director. He sternly commanded, "Make sure those men never step foot in Myeongdong again." The director understood the gravity of the order and swiftly agreed to comply. With Prota and Four Eyes now out of the room, the director prepared to deal with the scoundrels. Calmly, he settled into the nearest chair and coolly demanded to know who they worked for. The flustered loan shark then confessed. He was working for President Sayok Kong-ho. Meanwhile, on a nearby street, our protagonist and Han found themselves at a bustling food stall. Four Eyes was downing a shot of vodka, his relief and joy palpable. He'd finally lifted that massive weight off his shoulders. The protagonist then asked if, with his debt settled, Mr. Han was feeling much better. But he was met with another question in return, about the true identity of our mysterious hero. Four Eyes argued that the protagonist was far too young to conjure 50 million out of thin air, and even made those hardened gangsters tremble. But Miek, ever so calm, stated he was merely a student and showed his ID. Mr. Han, however, couldn't comprehend this and urged him to stop joking. He wanted the whole, unvarnished truth. In response, the great genius asked if that director from earlier and his own grandfather, Shuren Tayson, were some kind of loan masters. But Miek brushed it off, saying it didn't matter. He was there because he needed him, to do something for him. Still downcast, Four Eyes retorted that Miek already possessed everything he lacked, and questioned, "What could you possibly want from a broke stockbroker like me?" Being very direct, Miek told him he wanted him to do what he did best, trade stocks for him. The little genius, however, had absolutely no confidence in himself. He admitted he'd lost everything, drowning in a mountain of debt. But now the protagonist wanted him to dive back into that world. However, the hero asked if he'd ever truly considered something important, and that thought was simple: If he possessed immense wealth and limitless funds, he would feel powerful enough to crush any market scheme. In response, Mr. Han said he was absolutely certain because with money in hand, the market would be effortlessly manipulated by him, but he'd never had any money to begin with. Suddenly, Moyak handed him an envelope, telling him to open it. He then revealed that Four Eyes should use that to heat up the stock market. The next day, and it didn't matter if he lost everything. Anxiously, Mr. Han tore open the envelope, and it was a check for 100 million won. The hero said he should consider that a contractual deposit to kickstart their business. So he needed to prove his skills now that he finally had the funds. However, the protagonist had one condition. He said he would choose a specific stock item, and Four Eyes should do whatever he commanded, no matter what. Still confused, the little genius asked why he was doing this, if he didn't even know him. And now he questioned what Muyak would do if he ran away to a foreign country with all that money. But Muyak, unafraid, said he didn't care if he did that. He added that he knew he would still invest in stocks, even if he fled to another country. Now Kyung-san knew he had been caught in the act and felt embarrassed. Muyak added that, just as he didn't need to know his identity, he also didn't care who Four Eyes was. The hero sincerely said he was just giving him a chance with that money, so he needed to show his skills. Mr. Han was utterly surprised by such kindness and remained speechless. The protagonist had read in his biography that if Korea had given him a chance, and if the Korean stock market, if this world had any common sense, where rules actually applied, he never would have landed in South Korea. Now, as a hunting dog, our protagonist was ready to give that chance that Kyung-sen desperately needed to prove his worth. However, in that very moment, Kyung-sen had to become his personal hunting dog and hunt for him. And if Kyung-sen played his part according to the plan, our hero would amass enough capital to finally go up against his brothers. But one crucial piece was still missing for his empire to truly be established. That would be a physical force, fiercely loyal and ready to fight for him. Now he wondered, how was Park Dong-soo, the legendary delinquent, faring in Busan? On a seemingly ordinary night, the protagonist's mafia enemies were gathered in a lavish nightclub. One of them wasn't thrilled with what another member was proposing. Their plan, take out Dong-soo and carve up his territory among themselves. The big boss declared that Dong-soo could have dominated all of the territory, but he lacked loyal subordinates. And with all the other bosses locked up, he had no one left he could truly trust. They knew no one would fight for Park. All they had to do was strike swiftly, eliminate Dong-soo, and everything would be over. The other bald-headed member asked if he truly had orders for such a move. He then argued that they needed a solid justification. They needed a solid justification for others to trust their motives, or this would all erupt into total war, and they'd be completely screwed. But the big boss assured them not to worry, because he himself had received direct orders to keep tabs on Dong-soo. Now, he was determined to seize Busan and take Park out of the game for good. Meanwhile, in Busan prison was the legendary Park Dong-soo, who was chatting with a fellow inmate. He assured him he'd manage everything perfectly until his release. The prisoner replied that once he got out, he'd retire because he was simply too old, and told Dong-soo to manage everything as if it were his own. However, the guard declared that visiting hours were officially over. As the inmate departed, he simply said, "It was good seeing you, Park, after all this time." He then advised him to work hard and not to visit him too often. Finally, with a poignant look, he told Dong-soo to take care. The young rogue somehow sensed what the inmate was trying to convey to him and simply remained silent. And so, they bid farewell with profound mutual respect. Now, inside a luxurious, heavily escorted car, Dong-soo's lawyer asked if the visit had gone well. Dong-soo replied that the man had aged considerably over the years, and it didn't sit right with him. The young man beside him commented that Dong-soo and the other man seemed unusually close. But for Park, who was raised by his grandfather after his parents abandoned him, and whose grandfather suddenly passed away before he could even attend the funeral, it turns out His grandfather briefly worked in that area with Hyungnim when Hyungnim was young. And when Park received the news, he came running, sobbing. The little thug reveals that he declared he'd drop out of school and work for Hyungnim. But he received $3 million from him to finish school first. So, as soon as he graduated, Hyungnim gave him another $10 million to think for one more month. Exactly 1 month later, Dong-soo returned with all $10 million, stating that working for Hyungnim made far more sense than all that money. But upon hearing this, Hyungnim simply thought the kid was completely crazy and accepted him as his employee. Dong-soo mused that Hyungnim expected him to spend all the money and run away. However, he reflected that, at that moment, he seemed to be the only one around, and it didn't feel right, as he should have told that individual 3 years ago, so they could have avoided his imprisonment. The young man next to him, he asks if he's referring to that time he was saved, all thanks to a student who told him everything that was about to happen. Park gets all hyped up, talking about Miyagi and how that kid was no joke. He's eagerly anticipating their reunion. After learning he was coming to Busan, Dong-se headed straight for the Saesong trade and finally reunited with Muyak. They greet each other, and Dong-se notices the protagonist has grown so much. He comments that all that milk he drank really helped him grow. The formalities continued, with the protagonist asking if he'd been doing well, and the little thug asking if he was doing well in college. At that moment, Dong-soo introduced his lawyer to the protagonist, as it was their first time meeting. Getting back to business, Park said that transforming the organization into a corporation was no problem, so he hired a lawyer. As he was told, straightforward and blunt, the protagonist asked how much of their illicit operations he had already dominated, and how much he thought was left to finish. In response, the gangster said that as soon as they dominated the Hyundai area, they would be almost done, and after that, they'd need reliable guys to manage. Given this, Dong-soo asked why the kid was in such a hurry, since he'd been told it wouldn't take more than 6 months. The hero revealed that, with the war against crime in Seoul, large areas were in a power vacuum, but the organizations were regaining control. The conversation was interrupted when the door burst open, and a man shouted they were under attack. It was reported that Siamian, Yansendong, Bosadong, and Hayden had joined forces. Terrified, Dongzi ran to the entrance to see the commotion, and they came face to face with the mobsters from earlier, barging into the place. Those who had already spotted Dong-soo were ready to attack him. Park Dong-soo, he was utterly perplexed to discover his own companions were betraying him. The gangsters, brimming with confidence, knew they'd come out on top in this situation and taunted Park, asking how he'd been. One smaller thug couldn't quite mask his concern, yet it was crystal clear. He harbored a profound hatred for them all. A massive clash was about to erupt. All the mobsters quickly converged, ready for battle. The big boss noticed Muyak was also present, gearing up for the fight, but he couldn't care less. In fact, he thought it would just make things more fun. He even felt incredibly lucky. The protagonist reflected on the chaotic scene unfolding before him, as he had unwavering faith that Park Dong-soo had already utterly dominated all of Busan. Park simply couldn't believe that the big boss, Sungo, had betrayed him. He furiously questioned who had dared order this. Ian retorted that he obeyed no one's orders. Dong-soo himself had brought this upon them. This sentiment applied to all those present, who could no longer endure Park's suffocating tyranny. Some, like the mustache man, seemed to lament their drastic actions, but still pleaded for understanding. The hero reflected, bitterly, that Dong-soo had indeed exaggerated the kindness he showed his subordinates. While he questioned why they would betray him like this, they argued they simply couldn't stand seeing him dominate all of Busan. They declared they deserved to win in life too. The once revered gangster felt a profound sting from the betrayal of his own servants. Despite all the kindness he had shown them, Dong-soo's loyal lawyer exclaimed that he had already called for reinforcements. It would take a frantic 10 minutes for them to arrive. Suddenly, another thug charged at him, brandishing a knife, declaring he'd end this quickly. Muyak, however, remained utterly calm, asking if Park wanted his help. Dongsu saw no point in that, and quickly engaged in combat himself. He landed a blistering series of punches on one of the thugs, who was holding a knife. The other thug, who attempted to surprise him with a swift bat attack, was swiftly neutralized with a powerful punch to the ribs, instantly collapsing to the ground in agony, sending his back clattering. Park's allies immediately sprang into action, throwing powerful punches at their enemies. The scoundrel who lunged at the lawyer with a pipe is caught by the lawyer's sharp eyes. With incredible speed, Four Eyes delivers a knife blow to the assailant's wrist, then strikes his leg. Blood gushes out, but still, Park and his lawyer are now surrounded by the very men who betrayed him. Dongsu remarks that his lawyer is exceptionally good with a knife, asking if he spent time cutting sashimi or something similar. In response, Four Eyes calmly states he wouldn't have been hired if he were just a lawyer, as if scribbling with a pen with a hint of humor. Park then asks if he should pay him for this extra service, and the young man replies he wouldn't refuse. The big guy is already absolutely furious, telling his subordinates to attack. Dongsu hurriedly says he'd talk to his lawyer after everything was over, and with that, he charges into battle. At that very moment, he lands a precise kick on one of the thugs, sending him flying away, and the lawyer, now bloodthirsty, keeps cutting everyone with his knife. The little thug was relentless with his fists, punching his enemies, but suddenly, he's blindsided from behind, attacked by a bat, with his face bleeding. Dongsu was about to receive the final blow from one of his former subordinates. However, he rises again and lands a solid punch to his assailant's face, sending him flying and dropping the bat. And as he tries to get up, Park is already there to stomp on him. Without any expression, one of the little thug's friends looks worried about him and his head injury. And again, they're surrounded by numerous men. The big guy finally attacks Park directly, stabbing him right in the stomach, bringing both of them to the ground. Fortunately, Dongsu managed to brace the knife a bit in his abdomen, but he's still losing a lot of blood. The big guy declared, "Don't feel wronged if I kill you." He'd been utterly humiliated in front of everyone there, but as he ranted, blaming Park, he took a brutal punch to the back of his neck. Thrown aside, Muyuk worried about his ally, asking if the little thug was okay. The thug just muttered how humiliating all of this was, not giving up on his attack. The big guy, seething with rage, raised his knife once more, charging straight for Mihawk. However, the protagonist easily dodged, furious. The big guy unleashed a series of attacks, claiming the protagonist was also to blame for everything that had gone down. And finally, he lunged to stab the hero again, but was easily interrupted, receiving a perfectly placed punch to the face. After that, the protagonist twisted his wrist and finished him off with a brutal kick right to the groin. Now, he found himself writhing in agony. After all his attacks spectacularly failed, he swore Muyuk wouldn't get away with this. He wouldn't let it go. He'd hunt him down, no matter where he went. But Muyuk just grabbed him by his shirt and asked, with a serious expression, "Who are you?" which made the portly mafioso reflect on his utterly insignificant existence and the protagonist's sheer arrogance. And finally, the protagonist finished off the scoundrel with a solid punch straight to his mouth, leaving him utterly unconscious, thrown to the ground. One of Park's subordinates cradled him in his arms, asking if he was okay, but it was clear he was losing a lot of blood. Suddenly, the building was swarmed by several of Dongsu's men, who were quickly ordered to beat down the invaders. The main group cheered the arrival of the gang, saying it looked like everyone had shown up. Finally, the heroes group emerged victorious, with the mafia bosses kneeling before them. Dongsu asked the scoundrels why they'd gone so far. He stated he'd taken control of the area, trusting them to manage it, so they could continue to care for their families. And yet, they had stabbed him in the back. The scoundrels' silence infuriated Park, who told them to finally speak up and reveal their reasons. With a snobbish look, he scoffed at the mustache man. Feigning an apology, he questioned the little thug about who was truly behind all of this, and who gave the orders to take him down. And once again, they were met with absolute silence. Park then looked at Beyond and announced he would speak first. He continued, his pride still burning bright, forcefully telling Dong Su to shut up. Unwavering, Park demanded a knife from one of his subordinates, and then slammed the big guy's head to the ground. Pinning his arms, he seized Beyond's ankle. The little thug stated he himself caused this, so he shouldn't blame anyone else. At that very moment, the big guy completely panicked, desperately begging him to wait, but it was too late. And Park finally sliced off a part of his ankle, unleashing a torrent of blood. All the bosses were horrified by the brutal display. Incredibly, Beyond remained snobbish, his pride unwavering, defiantly calling Dongchu a bastard. The punk relentlessly kept asking who ordered that. With a mocking smile, the big guy sarcastically retorted that it was Park's own mother who ordered all of that. Still utterly cold, the punk calmly stated that he would regret that for the rest of his miserable life, from the confines of a wheelchair. Suddenly, one of them finally broke the silence, frantically telling them to wait. He then confessed that Samsung had ordered everything, claiming he was the one who had requested all of this. Upon his arrival, Park was utterly stunned by what he was hearing, and wondered why he would try to cause such trouble, even against him. It made absolutely no sense for his older brother to do that. To Park's utter despair, one of the other scoundrels reluctantly confirmed, admitting that it was none other than Hyung, who had ordered that everything be done. He added that Sejong had come directly to them, and ordered them to work under his command. Park was utterly bewildered by what he was hearing, struggling to believe the truth. The big guy then revealed that Kyung had been suspicious of him, since everyone else had been caught except him, thus leading him to question if he had perhaps sold information to the police. An out-of-control Park was on the verge of harming Byung once more, so he decisively slashed Park's other ankle, just as he had done with the first. A while later, a fragile calm settled over everything, and the protagonist then sat with Park in one of the rooms. They were drinking, trying to settle their nerves, when suddenly, the lawyer slipped silently into the room. He then revealed that all the injured had been dispatched to the hospital, and the leaders would be monitored in separate facilities. A deeply downcast Dong Su then asked if he genuinely thought his brother intended to betray him. He just couldn't understand, as he was diligently overseeing everything to avoid any lingering resentment, since he was also responsible for his sister-in-law and their families. Incredulous, he then questioned why Hyung would ever do such a thing, and what wrong he himself had committed. However, the protagonist was already privy to every detail, thanks to his future memories, just like in his previous life. Se-chan had also killed Park, and framed him for his own heinous crimes, thus proving to be a person Dong Su never truly knew. So, the protagonist explained that if they left Se-chan to his own devices, this kind of tragedy would surely repeat. He added that Park's subtle manipulation had been the hidden driving force that allowed the thugs to fall in line. Miek then stated that he needed to gather those who would truly stand by him and decisively remove those who were superfluous, ensuring they would be utterly incapable of returning. Dong Su was indeed deeply contemplative about all of this. Thus, the hero suggested that they should organize their next move first. Park felt insulted by the protagonist's words, saying he didn't truly know Se-chan well, but saw him as a father figure. Remaining cold and unflinching, the hero then declared that no true father would order the death of his own son, arguing that Park was no tragic prince figure. Continuing his point, Miek added that in those times, gangsters cared nothing for loyalty or pride, and stated that Dong Su was the last person, still clinging to an outdated romanticism. The protagonist then stated it was evident that Se-chan, who saw him as a father figure, ordered him to back off, and told him to snap out of that ridiculous dream. Once again, Dong Su got to his feet, absolutely furious. He couldn't stand the protagonist's words. However, he was still too injured for any sudden moves. Fed up with the situation, the hero rose to his feet and warned Park to handle his brother, or he'd nullify him from their working agreement. Mutia quickly exited the room, while the punk urged him to sit down. questioning what would happen if he kept acting like this. But the protagonist coldly asked if he still looked like the high school student he'd first met on the hospital roof. He argued that he'd given him the chance to work together on a plan involving his very destiny. So if he hesitated in the face of any problem, he'd have to reconsider everything. Still confident, the hero declared that if they didn't resolve things, by October, it would be the end for all of them. With that, he turned and left, slamming the door shut. Mark was left behind, saying he was ashamed of it all. The lawyer analyzed the protagonist, stating he was definitely no ordinary person. He was only 20 years old, and she couldn't even fathom what kind of life that young man had led. Dong-soo still felt proud to know Muyak, saying he wasn't joking when he spoke of him. Park knew the hero was right, and he knew that relying solely on a gangster's muscle wouldn't sustain him because without money, everything was just pointless. He lamented that the world lately was driven only by cold hard cash. So the four-eyed man questioned how they would resolve everything. With his head held high, Dong 11 declared they would clean everything up, and finally, they would head to Seoul. In a hotel, room service staff knocked on the door of a hotel room, informing them that the man's checkout had happened 4 hours prior. So the young man told the maid to open the door. They snuck in, curious about what lay within. There they came face to face with the mustachioed mobster, hanging, already lifeless. This sent the entire crew into a panic. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, a man wondered who had parked so terribly. He grumbled that they hadn't even left the contact number. But suddenly, one of the mobsters fell abruptly onto that very car, covered in blood, in a random butcher shop. Employees mentioned they needed to grab some ice from the freezer. However, when one of the men arrived, he stumbled upon something truly shocking. The brown-haired mobster was already dead, frozen solid and trapped inside the freezer. Meanwhile, the hefty boss was fleeing from other mobsters in his wheelchair. For a moment, he managed to shake off Park's men. He screamed that Dong-soo was a scoundrel who, besides breaking his leg and humiliating him, was now trying to kill him. He sped off wildly, vowing he wouldn't let it go and would get his revenge, as he wouldn't die so easily. But in his desperation, he crashed his wheelchair into a rock. This sent him flying directly into the sea, utterly helpless to save himself. Days passed, and now in Busan prison, a meeting was underway. Park's lawyer explained he was there to see Dong-soo's brother, on Park's behalf. The young man asked if anything had happened to Park, and the bespectacled man revealed that he had been attacked just a few days prior. The Saishon gang was behind the assault. The suited man handed a cigarette to the inmate, who pondered the attack on his brother. The lawyer quickly exclaimed that Park was safe, and he shouldn't worry. The brother said he was glad to hear that, but he didn't look happy at all. The lawyer then revealed that they claimed he was the one who ordered the attack. The man became absolutely furious upon hearing this absurdity and declared they had no idea who they were trying to frame. He flat out denied every accusation leveled against him and demanded to know if Dong-soo actually believed that. He was trembling so hard he couldn't even hold his cigarette. Furious, he abruptly flung it to the ground, and once again, he asked if Dong-soo believed this whole story, because if that were truly the case, he should go there personally to ask about it. In response, the lawyer placed a voice recorder on the table and ordered the man to listen to it. The audio was Park's voice saying he was very sorry for not being able to see him in person and was delivering this message through his lawyer. The audio continued with him saying he understood that he suspected him, as he had managed to hide all that time and escaped safely. He argued that he had been working hard to prepare everything so that when he finished his sentence, he could live comfortably. Dong-soo reported that he had been attacked recently, and the words were that his own brother had ordered it, but he didn't believe that. And still, Dong-soo exclaimed that doubt had found its way into his heart. With that, he told his brother that he would take care of his family and his sister-in-law. Then, coldly, he asked his brother to leave. He continued, saying that if he were alive, the monster in his heart would grow even larger, and if that happened, more blood would be shed. So if he refused, things would only get harder for both of them. Thus, he asked him to make his decision. The young man was completely dejected and asked the lawyer if Dong-su had really said that. Without expressing any feelings, the bespectacled man said, it was exactly as he had heard. Now, completely melancholic, Dong-su's brother reflected that Park had indeed said all that. After that, he asked what his brother planned to do after taking over Busan alone, as maintaining Busan wouldn't be an easy task. The lawyer revealed that once Busan was completely under his thumb, he planned to expand his empire to Seoul. Hearing this news, the young man couldn't believe his brother was truly aiming for such a colossal city. This was the brother he knew? All right. A sudden, hearty laugh burst from him. He was so proud of his brother, proclaiming him the ultimate boss in that very moment. He then rose from his chair and asked the lawyer to convey to his brother his deepest apologies. Finally, with a profound existential emptiness on his face, he urged the lawyer to take care of himself and to look after his own family too. On a dreary, rainy day, Park sat deep in thought in his office. His lawyer revealed, "Your brother passed away yesterday." Dong's sorrow was palpable, but he masked it, remaining stoic and strong. Afterward, at a bustling nightclub, Park's men cornered their enemies, ready to eliminate them. The same scenario unfolded with Park and his inner circle. Meanwhile, in another building, the enemies, poised for battle, snarled, "That bastard is already here." The old man spat. Saesong died because of Park, and still, he dares to try and dominate Hyundai, but without a shred of concern. Dong-su scoffed. Old men's talk always grows with their age. He then urged them, "Let's face each other quickly." And so, the brutal fight began, with the old man railing, "Park is an ungrateful dog, one who even bites its own master." Dong's men, too, charged headfirst into the fray. Soon after, everything concluded exactly as planned. The little punk was taking his medicine, while his lawyer arrived by the sea, reporting that the Hyundai cleanup was complete. He congratulated his men for a job well done, then poured another glass for his lawyer. Dong-su was relieved. Things were going smoothly, and everything was finally falling back into place. In that moment, he called his lawyer by name, a melancholic gaze in his eyes, and asked if he wouldn't be embarrassed to face Muyak ever again. Back in the mansion of the notorious loan shark, the old man questioned Muyak. "Did you foresee this strange turn of events? The government's actions?" Back then, Tayson revealed that dozens of top-ranking officials in finance and economics had vanished without a trace, supposedly on vacation or business trips, but not a single one had truly left the country. He then added that he suspected they were up to something secretive, and even their mole, the head of economic affairs, had no clue what was truly going on. Our protagonist, however, already knew the truth, and finally, a real-name financial system was about to be implemented. Muyak knew some chables, and financial companies had already sensed the changing tide after those economic officials went missing. Yet there was no way they could know, given the circumstances. So the hero replied that it had to be a new, real-name financial system, so they must be preparing for it discreetly. Worried, the old man admitted it was possible, and that such a crucial policy would demand secret preparation, meaning it could only be that at this moment. The old man then asked what our protagonist thought, and exclaimed that he believed it would be announced in the upcoming New Year's speech. Regarding this, Muyak disagreed, saying that, knowing the president's personality, there was a high chance he'd implement it by August. Hazen was stunned by the response. As that was next month, he asked if it wouldn't be far too soon. To that, Muyak explained that the timing of the announcement was the most crucial part of this new financial system, so it should be announced when least expected. These words caused the respected old man to fall into deep contemplation. However, still firm, the old man insisted it was too soon, as this was one of his presidential election promises, and getting it approved wouldn't be easy. In the assembly, Muyak assumed that probably the other chables had come to the same conclusion as his grandfather, so everyone would be caught completely off guard when the new system was implemented in August. And after all, less than a week after the announcement, it would sail through the National Assembly without a single vote, thanks to unanimous support from all political parties, and without causing even the slightest stir. The hero questioned if they shouldn't prepare for this, thereby settling accounts under third-party names, and anonymously, just as advised last time. The old man then stated that the anonymous accounts were almost set up, but the third-party accounts would take longer. Due to their massive scale, the hero knew he wouldn't be able to sway his grandfather. But even with just the anonymous accounts, he could still save him a significant fortune and prevent a loss as devastating as his past lives. Meanwhile, Tyson confirmed that, just as he'd sent $400 billion to America, as the hero had instructed, the director had laundered the money without a hitch. The protagonist expressed his deepest gratitude for everything his family had done for him. Just then, the old man inquired if Miek hadn't forgotten their plans for today, and he affirmed that he had not. The mafioso explained that if he were to contend with chaebols in the future, he needed to grasp how their minds worked. Now, he would be meeting the very person who embodied the living history of Korean chaebols, so he should go and absorb as much as possible from him. Inside the car, a new conversation began. The protagonist informed director that by the end of the year, he would be sending Han Kyung-young to America, and importantly, he should transfer all the funds from the U.S. account to him. The director questioned his trustworthiness, as 400 billion won was an immense sum of money. In response, Miek disclosed that he was planning to establish an investment company and hold a substantial portion of its shares. Ensuring director would be well rewarded for his role, had understood and affirmed he'd transfer it as soon as the official order was issued. Still, a persistent doubt lingered in Miek's mind. Thus, he inquired, who exactly is Director Ho? To which, Director Ho seemed puzzled by the question. The protagonist then elaborated that he was like a wild card, capable of anything, executing every task with impeccable precision, whatever Tae-san asked, no matter how complex. He then revealed that, on top of everything, he knew the director was behind President Yoo Jae-gang's disappearance from Myeongdong. Coldly, the bearded man stated that when his president gives an order, he doesn't ask why and simply obeys, as that was his unwavering oath. Miek realized this man embodied absolute obedience. Still curious, the protagonist pressed, asking if, even if his grandfather gave him an unreasonable order, he would still comply. Prota then gave an example, an order that could kill him, without thinking twice. The director said that if ordered, he would obey without hesitation. Still not satisfied, the protagonist asked what he would do if he ordered him to kill his own grandson. Remaining cold and calculating, the director simply stated that if ordered, he would have to obey. At that moment, Prota finally understood the director's true nature. Even in his previous life, he had shown unwavering loyalty to his grandfather, and after his death, he disappeared without a trace. With this revelation, Miek decided he had a favor to ask of this man, and so the director humbly offered to listen. The hero requested that he introduce him to someone like himself, which utterly surprised the director. Prota continued, explaining that he wanted someone who would follow any orders, without questioning, someone he could truly count on and trust. At that moment, the director understood the message and promised to arrange everything for him. Now, they had arrived at the mansion of the great chaebol leader, President Song. This man, pleased to have them there, said he was curious to see what the intelligent grandson of the president, who never stopped boasting, was like. He then added that he couldn't refuse this meeting, as it was Prota's grandfather who personally requested it. He wasn't sure he could teach him anything new. More kindly, the protagonist said that just hearing his life story was already something valuable to him, for he was the living history of the chaebols, of Korea's entire economy itself. Song's face instantly burned with embarrassment, especially since he'd now have to tell his own story. Well, that's where our recap ends. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like and subscribe button. Until our next adventure, bye-bye.